Chapter 8:19. Lionel leapt from pillar to pillar, his speed melding his body with the wind. He seemed completely unaffected by it all. His senses spread out over a large region. He spotted every single one of the force arts monitoring him, but dealing with them would be troublesome. He had the thought of going to the control room of the Milky Way Guild settlement to deal with all of them at once, but he knew that that idea would never bear fruit, so he didn't waste any time on it. Not only would he have not known where the control room was, he also had a feeling that there would be someone powerful monitoring the situation there very soon. By the time he found it, such a person would have been enough to paint him into a corner. He wished that he could have mapped out the entire building into his mind, but there were too much defensive structures and blockades getting in his way. So he simply had to deal with the fact his actions were being watched. He'll have to look into creating a new ability around that. It will probably require a unique method of utilizing Dream Force. Being able to map out an entire building with a single touch might come in handy in the future. Lionel made it to the first location very quickly. The last pillar waved about before a cave entrance carved into the tall face of a mountain. It was practically impossible to reach this place unless one took the path the sway pillars provided. Light refraction. Lionel's silhouette vanished. In these years, his skills in casting mage arts had reached a completely different level. The only reason he hadn't cast the upgraded, light refraction, until now was because it wouldn't have mattered. Anyone with a sharp eye would be able to pick out the subtle shifts in motion the pillars he stepped on would have, thus resulting in him being exposed anyway. But now that he was entering the mountain range, the situation was different, and it would be easier for him to hide. Lionel wasn't naive enough to believe that he would be so lucky as to stumble into an empty mine. A working establishment like this one, especially on a planet they settle upon for its resources, definitely wouldn't allow there to be a time where their mines weren't being worked on. If there was ever going to be a world I was stranded on and needed to get out of, I would definitely choose this one. This disaster world most definitely has a high number of wind elemental ores, without a doubt. In addition, it should have a high number of very durable ores as well. Lionel flipped over his palm, entering the mine as he brought the dictionary out. Though he could use his internal sight to scan for ores, why would he waste his stamina like this? He had to conserve as much energy at all time as he could. Plus, the dictionary was excellent at these things. The walls of the mine clearly showed the frequency of its use. Rather than being in a perpetual darkness, it was lined with what Lionel could only describe as exotic torches. They seemed to hold flickering flames, but when one looked closely, it turned out to be a collection of miniature force arts dancing about like fireflies. It was quite a unique invention Lionel had never seen before, but it still only took him a glance to formulate its blueprint in his mind. Interesting. Lionel turned away from the exotic torches and continued to walk down the well-made tunnels. He was careful not to displace any small rocks at his feet, nor leave any footprints. Toward that end, he had brought out his heavy spear, using its domain to decrease his own weight to an extreme. Scan the surroundings. What ores can I find in this mountain range? Ping. Lionel listened carefully, blocking out the sounds from reaching others. However, the list was far longer than he expected, causing him to cut the dictionary off. What ores are easily accessible? Ping. This list was far more manageable, though still quite long. If I want to make a getaway ship, functionality shouldn't be the only requirement. In fact, it should only be the bare minimum requirement. Teleporting in space was almost impossible. One would first need to make it to another planet before they could think to do this. The reason for this is because space did not have force. Force was birthed from planets, moons and stars, and would occasionally be present in other celestial bodies as well. If one wanted to teleport in the absence of spatial force, the only way would be if you practiced a force technique that allowed you to store spatial force, if you had a natural ability related to spatial force, or if you had an incredibly rare store of spatial force crystals. In addition, even if you had those things, due to the absence of other forces in space, detecting and tracking spatial force fluctuations also became far easier. This meant that one's whereabouts could be located in an instant and followed. Obviously, Lionel had access to none of these things. So his only option was to make it from planet Vincero to the next closest planet where he could then teleport. Hoping, of course, that this planet wasn't another disaster world. This meant that Lionel needed a ship strong enough to survive and break out of planet Vinceros' atmosphere. And he would also need a ship fast and nimble enough to escape any pursuit he might suffer as a result. Was he a madman for thinking he could do this when he had never done it before? Yes. Did he care? No. Lionel grinned to himself. This would be fun. Sit tight, Aina. I'll be back soon. At that moment, a woman holding a bottle of liquor stumbled out of a teleportation formation. Her eyes blurred and her tongue licked her lips and teeth like she had an addiction to doing so. She wore a tight one-piece that extended from her ankles all the way up to her shoulders and down her wrists. But it had a deep V-line down the middle that almost exposed her belly button. Her chest wasn't very busty, so she could get away with such clothing without too much worry. But they were still just busty enough to outline two round mounds few could take their eyes off of. She took a swig of her liquor and stumbled forward, only to be caught by the arm by someone who teleported in after her. Soon, a formation of four was formed, but the lady seemed too enamored with her liquor to speak to any of them. Shouldn't we get to business, Manson? What did the old man task us with? Chapter 820. Shut up. Manson steadied herself. Despite the fact she was barefoot, one would have thought with the way she was stumbling around that she was wearing the highest of heels. One could only imagine how hard the liquor she was drinking had to be to put a fifth-dimensional expert like herself in such a state. The three men who followed to Manson's back looked at each other and shook their heads. Clearly, Manson had been called up during her leisure time, but when was it ever not her leisure time? Their special team was basically on call at all hours of the day, and were a trump card unit of the Milky Way Guild. Adrian, a short man that hardly came up to Manson's shoulders. As though his genes didn't give him enough of a terrible set of cards, he was also balding at his crown and couldn't seem to afford a wig that didn't flap with his every moment. His codename was Shadow Rat. Rue. An average-looking man with two pistols strapped to his waist. One would have thought that he had come right out of an 80s-era Cowboys movie. Everything from his boots to his hat fit the bill. Even his twin guns had a retro feel to them as they sat in their holsters. His codename was Double Shot. Son. He was the tallest of them all, even towering above Manson, who was second. He had deep bags under his eyes that made it look like he hadn't shut them for some sleep in his entire lifetime. The discoloration was so jarring that it even appeared that he had suffered 2 blows to the face. His codename was, and then there was Manson, the stumbling drunk. One wouldn't be surprised if her codename was something like Drunken Fist. But in a feat of unoriginality, Manson chose the codename Drunken Feet for herself, not that she ever cared to use it. Everyone seemed to know her real name despite the fact the code was supposed to have been there to protect her. At that moment, though, the bottle of alcohol in her hand suddenly fell to the floor. The glass shattered and the brownish gold liquid flew in all directions, creating a puddle of booze and shards. However, as though she wasn't worried for her safety, Manson suddenly dropped to the floor, her palms slamming into the shattered glass. She glided forward on all fours, her bare feet eventually skidding through the mess. The 3 men didn't seem too surprised by what was happening. The fact Manson was practically sniffing around like a dog right now didn't perturb them in the slightest. Instead, they leaned back and enjoyed the view of her ass sticking in the air, taking in the good of the moment and not thinking too much. You think it's gotten bigger? Shadow Rat asked, pulling his wig down out of habit. They say alcohol makes you fat. Manson's always getting fat in all the right places. Double Shot replied in affirmative. Except her chest, Shadow Rat pointed out. You sure have a lot to say for a baldy. A man's value is beyond his looks. Shadow Rat snapped. Sure. I'll believe you when you finally get laid without having to pay for it. The mutual appreciation soon became bickering. Those stood between them, feeling their loud voices jar his eardrums and even their spittle bounce across his cheeks. He didn't move a single inch nor say a single word. He was just too tired to and couldn't be bothered. While they were arguing, he was just enjoying the nice view, his mind thinking thoughts no one would ever know of. Almost there. Manson suddenly came to an abrupt halt. Her nose, which had been in the air, angled downward with a sudden speed. She stood on all fours near a burning trench left by the battle between Lionel and the miners. In fact, If one replayed the video and overlaid it with Manson's current location, it was the exact spot Lionel had used his divine armor to teleport and vanish. However, wasn't focused on this at all. His mind seemed to be taking several mental pictures and storing them into his memory bank. In that abrupt movement, a subtle flash of pink had been revealed. Clearly these two arguing bastards were missing the real show. Nice. A pair of soft nipples, that's rare indeed. Usually they're hard by the time she enters her battle state. This is definitely one for the memory bank. One would never think that the biggest pervert of them all was the man who hadn't said a single word from start to finish. Manson leapt to her feet. Her palms, which should have been cut and bruised by the shards of glass, seemed completely fine. And her movements, which should have been sluggish and uncoordinated, had suddenly become a little too smooth. Her wardrobe malfunction seemed to fix itself. But even if it hadn't, she would have probably been uncaring. Let's go. She spoke, stepping back onto the teleportation formation. The three men followed after her, Doubleshot and Shadow Rat still barking at one another while Panda's lazy eyes remained trained on her swaying bottom. Back within the arena, an unexpected confrontation was taking place. No one had moved or attempted to leave since these things happened for fear that it would be seen as a sign of guilt or involvement in these matters. As a result, many stayed in a state of limbo, though many in the crowd were beginning to get restless. For obvious reasons, things were no longer being broadcast. The Milky Way Guild had no intention of showing off just how difficult it was for them to catch Lionel. And even the blaring alarms had finally come to a stop, leaving everyone in a state of unknowing. However, at that moment, while everyone was trying to remain blameless, a clash was occurring, the culprits of which were unexpected. On one side stood Lionel's teammates. On the other stood Yuri and Aina. Chapter 8:21. What is this supposed to mean? Joel stood as the core of the group. He knew that he had to. If he let anyone else lead the conversation, there would definitely be some words exchanged that couldn't be taken back. It was his duty to at least try to keep things as amicable as he could, but even he was on the verge of losing his temper. They had all been worried about Lionel. This state of ignorance they were all in just made things a million times worse, especially since they were all forced to stay here without the ability to interfere. It could be said that their nerves were fried, their tempers were short, and their fuses were even shorter. It was a powder keg that was difficult to keep control of, even for Joel. He could barely keep the edge of aggression from his voice, his tone even and calm. At that moment, he wished he could detach himself as easily as Lionel did. At that moment, Yuri stood with several things in her hands. One was the segmented cube that Lionel almost always left with Aina these days. It was one of his most important treasures, and it was the closest thing to home he had. His reasons, then, for leaving it with Aina so often was clear. He wanted her to know that he would always return, that she was where his heart was, and only with her could he truly unwind and relax. The second was a talisman that lay on top of it. From time to time, the talisman would light up as though someone was trying to make use of it. But Joel knew enough about the dimensional verse now to know that anyone who wasn't Aina that tried to use this would trigger something he wasn't sure if he was ready to handle just yet. Joel was certain that this was a mechanism Lionel had left behind to protect Aina. If anyone other than her used it, it would begin recording and relaying the situation back. He knew that if Lionel knew what was happening now, regardless of the danger, he would cut a path back. But that would only end up harming himself. Aina stood a step behind Yuri, her golden eyes reflecting the pulsing light of the talisman. Every time it happened, her gaze seemed to become more and more dead, the paleness of her skin reaching the point of sickliness. She could almost see Lionel on the other side. He should have been focused on his escape, but once or twice a minute he would pour his force into his own talisman, checking to see if Aina had left the restrictions of the pillar. The third thing was the necklace Aina always wore. Lionel had made it for her 19th birthday. Since that moment, she had never taken it off. The necklace was more than just a pretty gift. That day Lionel gave it to her was the day she was finally open about the feelings she had for him. She had almost forced herself onto Lionel for fear that if she hadn't done so, she would lose him forever. Lionel had disappeared for months back then, working on the crafts that helped them win the war against Terrain. Aina could still remember every feeling of horror, pain and anxiety she had experienced in those months. But that necklace was like a promise that had always protect her. The last thing was her mask. As sentimental as the other things were, Aina found this to be the second hardest to part with. Every item was like a piece of her soul she was giving away, but this one felt different for some reason. A mask should have been worn in shame, or when one wanted to hide. If any other man had given her such a thing, Aina might have assigned it with feelings of self-loathing and hate. And yet, when Lionel gave it to her, she could feel the care put behind it. He didn't give it to her because he was ashamed of her face. He hadn't given it to her because he wanted to help her hide either. He had only given it to her for the sake of helping her live in peace. Every day of her existence had been a constant torture. The pain, the itchiness, the constant reminder that her face was forever marred by the people she hated most in the world. That her mother had likely experienced far worse than just this, until she received this mask. It was as though she had stepped into a new world. One that didn't always have to be filled with agony and remembrance of the worst memories of her life. Instead, whenever she woke up and didn't feel the discomfort she had long become used to, she instead felt the care and affection of the man who poured his heart and soul into making it for her. Aina's eyes reddened, but no more tears fell. Even in her previous unconscious state, she had flooded her cheeks with more than her body could account for. At the moment, even if she wanted to cry more, she couldn't force anything else out. So she stood there, her lips pressed into a line of silence, her skin paling with every passing moment, her eyes losing the golden glow they once had. What is this supposed to mean? I've said it already, Yuri spoke calmly. Please pass on these things to Lionel. We have to leave now. What is that supposed to mean? Joel emphasized his words one at a time, the edge of his voice being more and more difficult to hide, almost like an ever-sharpening blade. It can mean whatever you want it to mean. Aina has not met her father in over a decade, and I plan on taking her to him. This is the most I will tell you. Now will you take these things or not? Chapter 8:22. Joel felt like he might snap, and he wasn't the only one. To his back, the towering walls that were Raj and Milan were like raging bulls wanting to go. Even the rookie, Drake, who was usually the most quiet and reserved of them, was staring daggers at Yuri. If it wasn't for their being raised on Earth and being uniquely keen on the differences between men and women, something that was far less prevalent in the dimensional verse, at least in terms of strength, they would have most definitely lashed out already. It was safe to say that had Yuri been a man, even Joel would have thrown the first punch already. It was one thing for Yuri to be speaking so rudely to them, but it was something entirely different for Aina to not even try to speak at all. Even if it might not be the case, it felt like she was looking down on them. While others might have been inclined to go easy on her because of her beauty, Lionel's teammates felt the exact opposite. They had never looked toward Aina as a potential partner to them. In their eyes, she could only be with Lionel and no one else. For all they cared, she could be a goddess and it would still be the same. If anything, her beauty made them look at her with an even harsher light. On the other side, it wasn't that Yuri wanted to be harsh, but if she wasn't, how would she move the spotlight from Aina to herself? With how fragile Aina was now, could she handle the scrutiny of these men? None of them were Lionel, but they were the closest things to brothers that Lionel had in this life. It felt as though she was facing the derision of his family. The fact that she could even stand here right now was the strongest display she could muster. Anything else was too much. So, Joel took a long pause. My captain is out there risking his life for our sakes. But your destination is so important to you that it's not even possible to wait for him to be safe? Is it really that this is so important? Or is it that you can't stand to look him in the eye? Aina's shoulders trembled, something that many might have missed due to its subtlety, but Yuri most definitely would not. At that point she snapped. Watch what you say. Yuri almost growled. Or I'll watch it for you. Do you think I'm afraid of you? Joel's eyes narrowed, his body almost giving off a steamy mist. His blood had revved to such a high level of revolutions that his dark skin began to heat up. He was really just that close to snapping, but he wasn't the first to do so. Fuck this. I swear to God if you stop me from talking I'll fight it out with you too, Joel. Who do you think you're talking to, tramp? If I ate you, you wouldn't even fit between the gaps of my teeth. Raj was fuming, his big belly rumbling as he tried to step past Joel. If it wasn't for the latter holding him back, he really would have swung already. Stop holding me back, damn it. She really thinks she can just say whatever she wants without getting punched in the lip. Then there's the one behind her who's suddenly as timid as a mouse right now. What? You're too noble to speak to us. Raj was still subconsciously careful with his words when he spoke of Aina. He still felt that there were some line he shouldn't cross over. Even for a man who usually always spoke his mind without the hint of a filter, he had too much respect for Lionel to completely unleash all the things he wanted to. But he had already had it up to here. Joel didn't let go of Raj, but he didn't stop him from speaking either. Fuck. Shit. I always said Captain wasted his time on her. She doesn't even have the courtesy to do it face to face. As though to add insult to injury. Oblivious to what was happening, the talisman shone with a bright light once again, sending Raj into an even worse spiral of fury. Even before they learned about Aina's scars, the team had always thought it was ridiculous that Lionel was so focused on one girl. They even teased him endlessly for it. After they found out about her scars and that the face they had come to know was just a cover-up by the high-tech cosmetics of the 25th century, they had felt that it was even less worth it. They were just teenage boys at the time, after all. All they could think with was their lower regions. They didn't understand why a star quarterback would ever waste so much effort on Aina when there were much better girls he could have. Of course, they never said these things aloud, keeping it to themselves. They respected Lionel too much, and while they might clown someone else among their brotherhood for banging an ugly duckling, it was clear that Lionel saw Aina as more than just a one-night lay. But now all that pent-up emotion, all those times they had bitten their tongues, had come bubbling forth in righteous indignation. They were far more angry for Lionel than they would ever be for themselves. Fuck. Every time I think about how many bitches Cap could have knocked down by now, I get pissed off. He could have a roster spot filled for every day of the week, but he's wasting his time on this. He spent years chasing you. And fine, you don't owe him reciprocation just because he liked you, but you did it anyway. And now you've become beautiful now, so you can't be bothered with Cap anymore. Well, fuck you too. Joel's initial reaction was that Raj's last words were too much. In fact, what was once subtle trembling on Aina's part had become obvious even to them. But there was no sympathy in their eyes, nor did Joel make Raj apologize for what he said. However, for Yuri, hearing these words, she saw red. Her arm raised with every intention of blasting Raj's head off. Chapter 8:23. Don't fight. These words didn't come from Aina. She was in too much of a daze from Raj's harsh words to even register what Yuri was about to do. If it wasn't for this person calling out, they would have definitely crossed a line of no return. Yuri might have only been trying to protect Aina, but killing one of Lionel's brothers would have been as good as signing a death warrant. There was no way Lionel would ever forgive something like that. And it was impossible to tell if Aina would ever be able to forgive Lionel for killing Yuri. Luckily, at that moment, a cloaked figure flashed between the two groups, her speed beyond their expectations. When she removed her cloak, they all immediately recognized her. This girl, Savon, had always been the third in the group of Yuri and Aina. Though Yuri had known she was here and among the 9-seated geniuses, Savon had been keeping her distance from Aina and Yuri ever since Conrad's death. Back then, when Aina did something no one ever expected her to do, it was probably Savon who had been most jarred along with Lionel about that experience. Of course, that moment was just yet another one of the reasons Lionel's teammates felt that Aina wasn't good enough for him. They knew their captain well, and could tell that the image he had built up of Aina, until that point, had all come crumbling down in a single instant. As devastated as Lionel had been that day, Savon was equally so, albeit for somewhat similar but mostly different reasons. Savon had always been the abrasive friend. When Lionel persisted in always asking Aina out, it was her who tried to draw a line between them. But things hadn't always been that way. Savon might have seemed to have a fiery and combative personality, but that was only because she had wanted to protect Aina. She hadn't had very many friends in her youth. Much like Lionel and Aina, she had only been able to enter Royal Blue Academy, because she was found to have a 5-star profession. With how poor her family was, making friends in a school filled with noble children seemed impossible. Until she met Aina. Aina always had a shy and reserved smile, but she treated everyone the same. Savon had long since forgotten the details, but by some miracle, she had managed to make her first friend. Savon had always been protective of that friendship, and it eventually translated toward always wanting to protect Aina. But the image she had of the girl she always admired and respected crumbled that day. The result was her maintaining her distance, not quite knowing how to confront her emotions. She closed off and shut down, just the same way she always had before she ever met Aina and Yuri. In the past few years, she had dealt with a lot on her own. The death of her parents. The difficulty of a young girl living alone in such a cruel world. She had even survived a war and managed to make it this far. Having done all of this on her own, she had more than just a little to be proud of. In truth, she hadn't planned on interfering in this situation. She didn't have all the information. She had no idea who was in the right or who was in the wrong, or even if there was such a clear line between the two at all. But as the argument became more heated, it became too difficult for her to ignore. The final straw was when she saw Aina on the verge of collapse. For a moment, she flashed back to the same shy girl who had reached out a helping hand to a younger her without a single friend. Right then, she felt that maybe the Aina she had known wasn't as much of an act as she thought. Don't fight. Savon repeated. Whatever disagreements you have, even if they can't be fixed through words, just give it time to breathe. Don't say or do something you'll regret for your lifetime. Yuri's hand trembled in the air before she clenched it into a fist. She held all of Lionel's things in a single hand before pushing it forward to Savon. Can you please give this to them? They won't accept it. Savon opened her mouth to respond, still feeling slightly uncomfortable. But before she could say anything, it was Aina who finally stepped forward, her gait somewhat uncoordinated and shaky. She reached for the things in Yuri's hand, not allowing the latter to stop them as she took them and stepped past Savon. Her arms trembled and her head lowered as she stretched the items toward Joel. In his mind, Joel had every intention of still refusing, but his arms almost moved on their own. Though the anger within him was still bubbling forth, it somehow felt suffocated, unable to control her mental coercion. Aina's feelings were practically painted all over her sleeve. For a moment, Joel, Raj, Milan and Drake felt like those feelings were theirs. Joel took hold of the items, clenching them just a bit too tightly. But considering the quality of them, they were hardly affected in the slightest. I'm sorry, Aina said softly, the trembling of her voice almost making Joel feel some sympathy. But he managed to keep it down. He had dealt with his fair share of women in his life. They had always been good at turning on the waterworks when it suited them before going off, and doing whatever hurtful thing they wanted forgiveness for anyway. Even if they were in the wrong, somehow they would make you feel bad for it. Joel had no intention of allowing such a thing to slide so easily. He didn't know if these were Aina's real emotions or not, or if it was just a facade. But it didn't matter to him. The talisman lit again, filling the silence that hung in the air with the soft whirring of energy. Joel looked down at it, his anger threatening to bubble back up again. These aren't words you should be saying to me, he responded coldly. Joel turned and led the boys away. Lionel dashed through the cave pathways, making use of blind spots in the monitoring system, to quickly gather up the materials he needed. His ship only needed to accommodate a single person, so he didn't need much. Even if he had to pull his knees to his chest, he would do it. He had no idea about the clash between Aina and his teammates, nor did he know that a group of 4 was stalking toward his location, led by a woman who seemed to have the nose of a hound. Important announcement below April 28, 2022. Chapter 824. Lionel dashed down tunnel after tunnel. He had already lost count of the number of miners he had come across. In fact, he had to give up on some valuable deposits for exactly this reason, realizing that it wasn't worth the risk. It shouldn't have been too difficult to accumulate how much material he needed, especially since it was a ship only meant to carry himself, but the task ended up being more difficult than he gave it credit for. It seemed that he would either have to buy a ship in the future that he could modify to his standards, or he would just have to build one completely from scratch with more time on his hands. As Lionel went from location to location, being forced to abandon what seemed like half of them due to too much activity, he grilled the dictionary on the danger of space. Once his head cooled down from the adrenaline, he realized just how crazy his own idea was. Jumping out into space just because he felt like it was the move of a maniac. Who knew what kind of dangers were out there? Unfortunately, this adrenaline didn't come from escaping as one might think. It was instead due to the creeping feeling at the back of his mind that only seemed to get worse every time he sent a string of force into his talisman. Lionel shook his head, dodging around a corner and pressing himself flat against a wall. Two miners walked past him with light steps, neither realizing that they had just been less than half an arm's reach from a criminal their entire organization was scouring planet Vincero for. Lionel had an advantage right now. Though he had been forced to reveal some of his skill as a force crafter in order to activate the deactivated teleportation formations, there was no way they could guess he would have the skill to build his own ship. The question remained, then, what did they think he was doing? Did they believe that he was waiting to die? It was more likely than not that they believed he was waiting to be rescued. In that case, what course of action would they take? Obviously, anyone confident in saving him would be a true rival of the Milky Way Guild. That means that the Guild would definitely turn most of their resources toward preparing for this enemy. What did this mean? It meant that Lionel could safely conclude that at least within a day or two, at most a handful of elites would be coming after him as the Guild entered a state of war. Lionel was only helped by the fact his actions seemed like their own declaration of war. The Milky Way Guild probably thought that some great power was targeting them by first staining their prestige. What would be a greater stain than Lionel escaping unscathed? Of course. How could Lionel have not already considered all of this? Lionel slid past another group and rounded another corner. His arm suddenly shot forward, his actions looking like he wanted to punch a hole through the rock face. And yet, there wasn't even a single sound or ripple as Lionel's arm slipped right in. Beads of sweat fell from Lionel's brow as little Tolly wiggled around his arm, slipping through a narrow crack, and appearing at the tips of the fingers he had pierced into the wall. With deft movements, little Tolly devoured a large cavity around the ore Lionel was aiming for before the ore vanished into his spatial ring. Lionel pulled his arm out along with little Tolly and sprinted away. The wall his arm had just been through seemed completely untouched. Lionel gulped down huge breaths as he ran. That was already the dozenth time he had completed that action, and he felt he was already pushing himself past his limits. That should be enough for now. If he didn't recover, he would end up placing himself at risk. Using spatial force, especially without activating his divine armor first, was really taxing for Lionel. Unfortunately, activating his divine armor alone was even more taxing. Lionel could only blame himself for this, honestly. He had been overly ambitious in creating his divine armor, so he made use of evolution ores in the process. As a result, an armor that should have been peak 4th dimensional at best was comparable to the 5th dimension already. The fact he could use it at all was a miracle. The good news was that as Lionel grew, he wouldn't need to replace his divine armor so quickly. And once he broke through, his spatial affinity would skyrocket. The bad news, however, was that he needed to deal with it being an extraordinarily heavy weight to him for now. This is enough. I just need to find a quiet place. Lionel had already collected enough ores to fill his 5 by 5 by 5 meter spatial ring to the brim. Luckily, he had some snow globes he always kept on hand to give him some breathing room in this regard, or else he might not have had enough. Using the dictionary, Lionel found a location with plenty of escape routes and not a single soul within 200 meters worth of tunnel. After deploying numerous detection throughout all tunnels, he immediately got to work, pulling out all the ores he needed. At the same time, the over 500 split minds he had assigned toward designing the blueprint of the ship had already formulated several iterations and tested them all using the information about space the dictionary had given. Let's go, little Tolly. Lionel's gaze suddenly became ice cold. He threw every distracting thought from his mind, turning all of his thinking power, aside from what he reserved for Dream Counter, toward the task at hand. Not only would this be his most difficult craft to date, but he had to complete it within a day, preferably a half day. 3 hours. I give myself 3 hours. Chapter 8:25. Lionel opened his arms wide. Suddenly little Tolly, who could fit neatly around his wrist, became a large blanket of liquid, silver metal. If the little guy, or rather not so little anymore, wanted to swallow Lionel whole, it was more than possible. In 2 years without Lionel, little Tolly had grown stagnant. But even before that, the metal spirit had long since entered the 4th dimension, and was well on his way to the 5th. If not for Lionel stalling his progress, he would have already entered such a state. Luckily, despite still being in the 4th dimension, little Tolly didn't seem to have many problems swallowing and molding 5th-dimensional metals. But this only made sense. After all, in order to step into the next level, a metal spirit would need to be capable of devouring on step above it. That said, there was less ease to it. Lionel had to be more forceful and deliberate with his control. The difference was akin to filling a cup with water versus filling one with wax. In the first case, the water would easily take the shape of the vessel. In the latter case, though, the wax would have to first be melted. And in the case that it wasn't melted, one would have to struggle to mold it by hand and press it into the shape you wanted. Given this analogy, molding 4th-dimensional metals was like water, while molding 5th-dimensional one was like wax. Even with this being the case, though, Lionel's skill didn't seem to miss a beat. His mind had split so many ways that he could control every minor little detail with a level of comfort that made it seem as though it was no more difficult than it had ever been. The design Lionel had decided upon would be centered around the dictionary. It would be his navigator and his trusted AI. Lionel had reached a point in his skill where he was confident enough to do this, and he also realized that it would make much of the rest of the process easier on him. With the internals figured out, all he needed to focus on were the defenses of the spacecraft and its propulsion system. The outer hull would be an alloy of splitting sky and dusted cloud Oregon. The inner hull would be formed of whistling howl Oregon splitting sky, or was a durable but light wind elemental type Oregon. It was very good at deflecting winds and dealing with high speeds. At the same time, it had more durability than the usual wind elemental ores. Its domineering name came from its wind nullification ability. A location where the ore swept through would be devoid of wind force for a moment. At least that was the illusion that it portrayed. The truth was that the wind elemental force was being frozen, its particles attracted to this, or almost like a magnet. This usually made this or a good option for wind elemental weapons used by those who had mastered momentum-type techniques. However, this was maybe the first time such an ore was being used as the shell of a ship. Dusted cloud ore was a star elemental type Oregon. It was named as such because it was often used as a finisher, somewhat like a coat of painting for certain types of ores. This coat of painting, though, was great at muting the effects of the metals it coated, as well as giving it added durability and heft. Finally, whistling howl ore was a wind elemental vein type, or capable of using accumulated wind force. Usually, ships were either designed with light or space elements in mind. It was rare for an interplanetary ship to be built with the wind element as its focus for obvious reasons. It wasn't the most efficient. There was only so fast wind could propel you through the vastness of space. However, Lionel had his own plans about this matter. His conviction only seemed to grow as his hands moved faster and faster. It went without saying that while Lionel had improved his crafting through his dream world in those 2 years, he also improved his hand and finger speed and coordination. He was already at the superior grade 2 designation at a bronze standard. If it wasn't for the limitations of his body, he knew that he would already be at a superior grade 1 designation. The hours blazed by one after another, Lionel's hands never pausing for even a moment. In fact, he only seemed to quicken his pace, as though he was only becoming more and more comfortable. "Since you're already here, is there a need for you to continue to hide?" Lionel's voice came suddenly, his hands never stopping. Bits and pieces of ship seemed to come together like fusing tides. But Lionel knew he wasn't quite finished yet. Of the 3 hours he had given himself, only 2.5 of them had passed. It seemed that even his worst-case scenario wasn't as worst-case as it should have been. It could only mean that those looking for him were indeed quite skilled. Lionel believed that best shot at finding him would be some sort of tracking ability or a minor level of omniscience similar to Goggles. But the latter ability would require a lot of information that Lionel had been sure not to leave, while the former should have been very difficult given the climate. How would you follow someone's scent with so many winds whipping about so viciously, for example? By the time those experts found his trail, whatever smell he had left behind would have been scattered to the other side of the planet. And if they instead chose to observe Lionel's actions instead, he had left behind enough subterfuge to delay them for 3 hours. But it seemed that even he wasn't perfect. Now he had an incomplete ship and 4 experts walking out from the shadows to face him. Of course, it only made things better that this mountain happened to be filled with miners as well. All in all, this was an excellent situation indeed. Lionel sent a glance toward Manson and the others, scattered pieces of his ship laying about. Chapter 826. Little Blackstar gripped onto the ends of Lionel's hair, baring his little teeth toward the coming enemies. If it wasn't for the sturdiness of Lionel's skin, his scalp might have begun to bleed already. Lionel reached a hand up and gave the little mink a pat on the head, trying to calm him down. The instincts of beasts were usually beyond that of humans, so it was quite clear that Blackstar felt that both he and Lionel were in quite some danger. But this only seemed to be the tip of the iceberg. Little Blackstar's attention had definitely been caught by something else as well. Manson's gaze wasn't on Lionel. Rather, from beginning to end, she had never taken her eyes off of the scrap metal, or what seemed to be scrap metal, before them. Even now, she couldn't be certain of what Lionel was building and didn't even know if it was 1 step away from completion, or if it was 100 steps. This was why she had chosen to be cautious from the very beginning. Whatever hint of drunkardness she had having vanished a long while ago. She had been hoping that she could observe in silence for long enough to figure out what it is that Lionel was building, but she hadn't expected to be called out like this ahead of time. With Shadow Rat's abilities, being found out before they wanted to be found out almost never happened. It was safe to say, then, that the one who was most shocked was the short man with the flapping wig. In fact, he forgot to hold it down for a moment, causing it to almost flip off his head entirely. Manson finally took her eyes off of the pieces that lay around Lionel. She wasn't a force crafter, so though she might be able to recognize an ore in its raw or purified form, after it was processed like this, she was at a loss. Still, she couldn't help but look toward Lionel with an eye of curiosity. Even if she couldn't name these metals, what she could do was tell with absolute certainty that they were metals of the 5th dimension, each and every last one of them. Yet, not only was this child able to mold and manipulate them, he was clearly building something. She was a layman, but at least she understood that this meant whatever Lionel was building had to be of the bronze grade at worst, right? Manson's heart skipped a beat. 3rd dimension. 21 years old. Escaped an encirclement of 5th dimensional existences. And a bronze crafter? What the hell was this? Out of habit, Manson began to lick her lips and teeth again. But the distinct lack of an alcohol taste left her feeling slightly frustrated. However, she was filled with a different sort of intoxication when she looked toward Lionel. And it definitely wasn't because of his handsome looks. She could almost feel it already. What kind of high would she experience snuffing out such a genius? How good would it feel? Manson's bare toes curled along the cold stone ground, her legs squeezing. 10 short claw marks were left in their path, filling the quiet atmosphere with the sound of scraping and cracking stone. Manson's entire body quivered, a gentle gasp leaving her lips. Her breath was so hot that despite the temperatures not being near freezing, a steamy fog left her. Her face flushed red and her pupils dilated. She looked as though she had entered a drunk state once again. Except this one seemed even less innocent than the one from before. Sparks flew within Lionel's dreamscape, but he frowned when he noticed where they came from. That region of his dreamscape only lit up when Aina reached a less than holy peak. The fact it was lighting up now for a woman he didn't even know filled him with an irrational rage. Lionel didn't know why he was reacting this way. Maybe it was because his talisman still wasn't connecting. Maybe it was because he felt he had done something wrong. Or maybe it was purely because this woman was encroaching on something she should have never touched. But whatever it was, he was pissed. Lionel's pale violet eyes suddenly gained a flash of red. Bang! The tunnels quaked. A surge of violet-red energies emitted from Lionel's body. In one instant, he had been a calm young man unperturbed by all. In the next, he felt like blasting his fist through someone's chest. Manson shot forward, using the ground she had scraped as an anchor to propel herself. She seemed to have every intention of destroying everything before her, including Lionel's crafts. No matter what it was, it wouldn't matter if it was all in pieces, right? She rose her leg up high, performing a perfect vertical split. Winds and forces swirled around her bare heel as she axe-kicked it downward. Just the momentum of her planted leg was enough to destroy everything. As for the strength of her actual kick, did it even need to be explained? Lionel coldly watched on. His senses reached out and grasping at each one of the pieces of his craft. With a thought, they all shot backward under his control, floating as though he had a telekinetic ability to manipulate them. Lionel dodged out of the way of Manson's kick, trying to store away the pieces of his craft one by one. It was just unfortunate that doing so required touching his hand to them. The result was Lionel dodging around the wide cave expanse, jumping, hopping and leaping toward the pieces he purposely hung in the air out of the way of danger. He had expected Manson to target the pieces of the craft after a while, but she was so enamored by the prospect of crushing him that none of it mattered to her. If Lionel was dead, would he even get the chance to use his craft in the first place? So why not focus on ripping his head off? Chapter 827. The seething rage pumped through Lionel's veins. He tried to rationalize it, but after a moment he was too pissed to do even that. Every time Manson felt like she was close to bursting his head like a watermelon, her body would be rocked by a wave of pleasure, and spark yet another connection in Lionel dreamscape. After the third time, Lionel cut himself off from that bundle of connections entirely, his thoughts fuming. And yet, every time it happened, Manson's face would only become more flushed and her actions more drunk. Even as this happened, her kicking speed seemed to increase and her body became more limber. Lionel was suddenly having a tougher and tougher time predicting her next attack, because they simply had no logic to them. This forced him to go from using his predictive model toward his muscle analysis model. Lionel was under no illusions about his strength versus Manson's no matter how pissed he was. As far as he could tell, Manson was Tier 2 of the 5th dimension while the rest of her companions were Tier 1. Lionel wasn't able to dodge her attacks because he was strong enough. He was completely relying on his ability to do so, and that was quickly becoming almost impossible. As though Manson was just stretching her limbs and only just getting into a rhythm, the whistling of her kicks became sharper and sharper, trailing Lionel by a hair's breadth. The kids survived quite a while. Doubleshot spoke, his hands itching. She just likes playing with her food. Just enjoy the show. She's getting more perky. Shadow Rat responded. As usual, didn't say a word, taking a snapshot of every wardrobe malfunction he could catch a glimpse of. This is some good material. ITLL lasts me at least a week. This is good, really good. It's been about half a minute. Don't you think the miners should have heard something by now? Shadow Rat asked. If they know what's good for them, they'll stay out of Manson's way. I doubt she'll go as easy on them as she's going on this kid. It might also be that they're just used to it and know to mind their own business, Shadow Rat replied. I used to work the mines too. Everyone is trying to meet and surpass their quotas for an extra bit of cash. Stealing someone else's deposits isn't very rare. Fights like this happen all the time. Ah, I forgot you were a sewer rat before. Go fuck yourself, you think it's easy being here? I made more money doing this than you've seen in your lifetime. Maybe if you had made less money, and had gotten more sun, you'd be less bald. I hope your gun jams, son of a bitch. I hope your wig glue dries like dandruff, baldy. Bang. Lionel felt his hair whip about, the side of his uniform hammer pants gaining a large rip as Manson's failed to land yet another axe kick. Her heel shattered the ground, but immediately became an anchor point as she swung her other leg in a roundhouse. Her kicks were as fluid as any sequence of punches. They were relentless and flexible, perfectly timed and powerful. At that moment, Lionel grasped at the last piece, allowing it to vanish into his spatial ring. He rolled to the side, avoiding another disastrous heel and leaping up to his feet. Despite the unmoved look in his eyes and the all-pervading coldness that exuded from him, his actual appearance was quite terrible. His clothing was ripped in many places, his skin was already dripping with sweat, and the flying particles of stone that had hung in the air, due to Manson's violent barrage, clung to him, making his look dirted and battered. Still, despite all of this, he still didn't have a single injury on his body. Even as he breathed long and hard, his body moved freely. This is about 20% of her strength. The others still haven't moved because they're quite confident in her ability to end all of this. Should I take the opportunity to kill her? Or should I run? Lionel coldly analyzed Manson's actions, dodging in a sorry state every time. He had already thought of 3 plans with a better than 80% likelihood of ending in her death, each one more bolted down and perfected than the last. But every time he hesitated about whether to proceed, Manson's brow would twitch and her actions would shift. It was as though she subconsciously felt that something was about to happen and reacted accordingly. The more drunk her mind became, the sharper her instincts were. None of her actions actually countered Lionel's intentions. However, the fact she reacted at all sent alarm bells off in Lionel's mind. If she could adapt with nothing to go off of now, then the more information he gave her, the better her adaptation response would be, and the less chase he would have at succeeding. If it wasn't because he was infuriated, Lionel would find this ability of Manson's to be fascinating. But the fact she seemed to need to be inebriated to use it was a huge negative. Unless she could fight someone she wanted to kill as much as Lionel. In that case, Lionel's foot planted, his body attempting to slide by Manson's kick. It shot down from above, barely missing his chest by a centimeter. Yet before it even had, in a feat of shocking flexibility, Manson's back arched backward, planting her palms to the ground as she aimed her once planted leg for Lionel's chin. Usually Lionel would dodge, but a kick from Manson's currently bridged body position was likely amongst the weakest in her arsenal. It was still enough to tear the head off a fourth-dimensional existence 9 out of 10 times, but Lionel happened to be the one. Bronze runes flickered to life beneath the grime and sweat on Lionel's skin, fingers from both his hands intertwining as he went to block Manson's kick. Shadow Rat, Double Shot, and Panda's eyes glowed. A blow was finally about to connect. It was a nice run, but it seemed the kid was at the end of his rope. However, what happened next shocked them. It wasn't because of the result of the kick, but rather because of what happened before it even landed. Manson shouted out, calling to her team members. "Shoot now." Her words slurred, but the meaning was clear enough. She wanted them to interfere? Despite his confusion, Double Shot reacted on instinct. His gun flipped out of its holster with an unconscious speed, his palm sliding back across its barrel twice in quick succession as he shot from his hip. The world slowed in his eyes. He could already see the bullets piercing Lionel, whose hands were still prepared to block Manson's kick. One through his throat, the other through his skull. As slow as the world was for Double Shot, though it was even slower for Lionel. But this wasn't the happy tale one would have thought it was. "This shameless bitch," was just the first of Lionel's thoughts. Chapter 828. Lionel's mind accelerated to the point he could almost see the movement of the bullets through the air on a frame-by-frame basis. As old and dated as Double Shot's pistols looked, they shot with a speed beyond anything an old Western movie could match. In fact, if those 2 shots were fired off in a third-dimensional world, even space itself would be torn apart to carve a path out for them. With that speed came a lack of responses Lionel could make. He was at most 50 meters from Double Shot, and the speed of the bullets wouldn't allow him to tilt his head and neck out the way in time. Or, rather, it wouldn't have had Lionel reacted to the 2 shots as opposed to Manson's words. Lionel's ability had been entirely focused on Manson, and more specifically the movement of her muscles, from the very beginning. The moment her throat prepped to speak, he had already picked up on it. For a woman who hadn't spoken a word since she entered, what could she possibly be preparing to say? Obviously it wasn't for idle chit-chat or smack-talking, so she could only have been calling for her teammates to take action. Assigning a probability of over 90% to this, Lionel had already been prepared. The earth beneath one of Lionel's planted feet shot up at an angle, sending him flying to the side. The upward swing of Manson's kick reached him long before the bullets would, and even as the earth rocketed him to the left. One would have thought that Manson's toes would be fragile and delicate like most everyone else's, but just a slight graze against what was just Lionel's prepared defenses tore a bloody gash through his wrist. Lionel's jaw clenched as he rolled out of the way, sending one of his minds to inspect his injury. It was luckily only skin deep, but it had only been a small measure away from damaging his muscle and ligaments. Had that happened, he didn't know if it would still be possible to complete his craft. His hands were too important. Lionel thought he had accounted for the upward swing of Manson's kick. Yet she somehow managed to change her trajectory just enough that he was both nicked and was unable to react at the same time. To make matters worse, she actually tore through his bronze rune-activated defenses so easily. As surprised as Lionel was, Manson was even more so. She had been certain that she would at least lop Lionel's wrist off with that kick, but she found more resistance than she expected. How did he have such a strong body? Manson made use of the momentum of her kick to flip herself back to her feet, her movements looking as agile as a cat's. If it wasn't for her drunkard appearance, she would definitely be capable of playing the role of feared assassin. But the light gasps that left her lips and the flush to her face ruined that entirely. Get in formation. Manson's words slurred again. As much as Manson's previous words shocked her team, this was like a nuke going off in their minds. Even though they always set out as a team, the reality was that they rarely, if ever, actually used their formation. Usually it would just be one of the three of them dealing with the target. As for Manson, she only participated if the mission was interesting enough, like if there was a spark involved. But the four of them all taking action at once? That only happened if, how annoying. Lionel's gaze grew colder. It seemed that they truly wanted to take things seriously. He had yet to ask the dictionary what Manson's ability was because he hadn't gotten any breathing room to do so, but he could piece together most of it himself. Manson had an intuition ability type. This ability type was split into alert, foreshadowing, instinct, prediction, and foresight. Once again, the fifth, in this case foresight, was reserved for savants. From what Lionel could tell, Manson was usually in the mid to high level of the second stage, foreshadowing. She could gain an inkling of what was happening and react to it, but the image wasn't clear nor obvious. Often those at this stage had to rely on many decades of experience and training to make good use of foreshadowing. Manson, though, seemed to be quite unique. She had learned to dull her senses to an extreme to simulate a higher level of her intuition ability type, crossing over into high levels of instinct, bordering on prediction. The caveat, though, was that she had to be drunk off alcohol, or orgasms. If Lionel wasn't so enraged with Manson encroaching on something she shouldn't have, he would have been impressed by her ingenuity. In a third-dimensional world, Manson would practically be an oracle, at least when it came to one-on-one combat. In a fifth-dimensional world, though her ability could almost be classified as useless to most, yet she managed to find a way to make it so powerful. It felt like the methods of the dimensional verse were endless. But this was no time to be praising Manson. With her words, Shadow Rat double shot and came forward, encircling Lionel as though he was some sort of demon warlord. One would have thought that with their personalities, they would crack a few jokes or tease Lionel a bit, but they seemed to have thrown all of that out of the window. It was either that they were consummate professionals, men who understood when it was time to play and when it was time to work, or they had an almost blind confidence in Manson's intuition. If it was the former, Lionel would still have some wiggle room. Even as professionals, there was a chance they might still believe him to be beneath them. But if it was the latter, that would mean that right this moment, they saw him to be just as dangerous as Manson believed him to be. And that was a problem. The blood from Lionel's nicked wrist rolled down his forearm and pooled at his elbow, culminating into a drop that fell toward the cracked stone floors. As though a cue, the instant it rebounded against the ground, Panda's aura surged as the entire hollowed cave was plunged into darkness. Important announcement below April 28, 2022. Chapter 829. Lionel's pupils constricted. In that moment, it wasn't just about sight. If it was that and that alone, he could take this ability to be nothing more than a parlor trick. With his internal sight, why would he care about a little darkness? This cave wasn't exactly well lit to begin with, especially given the sheer size of the space. However, it wasn't just that. Lionel felt his senses get cut off one after another. First it was sight, then hearing, then even his touch went. As a final cherry to top it all off, his proprioception was completely cut off. Lionel's first instinct was to release his domain, but he restrained himself. This sort of uncomfortable feeling where he wasn't even sure of the relation of his limbs to the other parts of his body, even left him suffocating. Proprioception was such a fundamental sense to the human body that those who lost it wouldn't even be able to walk without watching their feet move. It was the ability for one to subconsciously know where your body parts were in relation to one another. Even if one closed their eyes, they would be able to touch a finger to their nose without much difficulty or thought. Someone who had lost their proprioception would be completely unable to do such a thing. Just living day-to-day life without proprioception was enough to drive someone mad, let alone having lost it in the middle of a battle. For Lionel, who was used to controlling each and every aspect of his movements, it was no wonder he felt so stifled, and almost reacted on instinct rather than logic. He couldn't reveal his domain so easily. While they should already have information on his chain domain, as far as they were concerned, all it could do was help restrain people. And if used a bit cleverly, it could give him some flexibility to his movements. But they wouldn't understand the suppressive abilities of his domain, nor would they know that it would mostly give him control of his body back. He had to save this for the perfect moment. My senses are cut off, my proprioception is gone, and my internal sight has been restricted to an extreme. I can't monitor the detection arrays L left behind anymore, but I have just enough range to cover this entire cave space. There was no way that the 4 teammates would guess that Lionel would still have such a long range, and Lionel immediately made countermeasures to ensure that Manson couldn't learn this through intuition. He'll lock onto the 3 men, simulate where the woman will be, and avoid allowing my internal sight to touch her. Only lock onto her when she enters a 10-meter range. That will be cutting it close, but it should be just enough to react. Lionel's internal sight sprung into action. He wrapped it around his own body, replacing his lost senses with it. He locked onto Double Shot, Shadow Rat, and then finally he began to simulate Manson's movements, using the shifts in the ground to avoid accidentally passing her by with his internal sight. Lionel made all these decisions in a split moment. His drop of blood hadn't even completely settled onto the ground when he finished. 10 meters. The voice wasn't meant for Lionel to hear, but he knew it was Manson's. The moment it descended, he knew his plan had worked. Manson's voice traveled through this odd dark domain in such a way that made Lionel realize that it was meant to be a covert form of communication built into Panda's ability. This was a huge plus. It made it even easier for Lionel to pinpoint Manson's location. He just had to pay attention to these strings of conversation. At that moment, Shadow Rat vanished. He seemed to sink into the ground, his short body disappearing without a trace. And yet, even after another split moment, he didn't appear anywhere. However, that didn't stop Double Shot from suddenly letting off another 2 rounds. Lionel's body shifted slightly to the side. He thought about letting the rounds hit him, just so that he could continue to leave Manson in the dark. But in the end he decided to test something. It was a calculated risk. He realized that when he intercepted Manson's voice, she hadn't seemed to notice. At the very least, her intuition hadn't gone off. There was a chance that Manson had realized and was simply hiding this fact, but Lionel believed that there was a 70% likelihood that she hadn't noticed at all. If that was the case, that meant that the less involved with Manson herself the action was, the less likely it was that her ability would pick up on something odd. Not only had her voice left her body, but it was being carried by an ability that wasn't her own. This made it difficult for her to read Lionel. Perfect. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The more things he could take advantage of, the better. However, what he heard next made him realize that things would be difficult. Lionel had managed to jump the hurdle of his lost proprioception by coating his body in his internal sight. That way he could watch his every movement and control it at the same time. Thanks to this, he was able to sway out of the way of the bullet. But He dodged. Panda's voice traveled to Doubleshot and Manson, making Lionel's heart skip a beat. It seemed that he had still underestimated this ability. It could not only cut off his own senses, but despite being affected themselves, the 4 teammates had one of them who could see just fine. Panda might have not realized that he was listening in on their conversations, and he also couldn't tell the range of Lionel's internal sight, but he could still keep track of almost everything that happened within his ability's range. Just when Lionel's mind was kicked into overdrive again, a shadow suddenly gained form to his back, melting into the darkness of Panda's domain seamlessly. Shadow Rat had appeared again, a glistening dagger in his hand. Chapter 830. Lionel's pupils constricted. A domain that cut off the senses. A sharpshooter that wasn't bothered by it. A leader that could ignore it all with intuition. And now a 4th team member that could make use of the all-encompassing shadows to move where they pleased? The composition of this team was enough to make anyone numb. But for Lionel, his eyes suddenly lit up. He had gotten the final piece of the puzzle he needed. Little Black Star. Yip. Yip. Shadow Rat suddenly found himself frozen, stuck in a state of corporeal and shadow. He couldn't retreat and he couldn't advance. It felt like some higher being had grasped onto his very soul. PCHU. In the darkness, a little mink flashed. When he appeared again, grasped between his little claws was a still beating heart. With just the smallest squeeze, it burst apart, falling in a rain of blood and gore. Panda was the only one who could see this scene. The contrast between Black Star's adorable little twitching whiskers and his bloody actions made even the apathetic veteran's heart seize. To use a darkness domain and a shadow teleportation ability against a sovereign of the shadows. It was like leaping with both feet into an early grave. Panda was at a loss for words. He didn't quite understand how to explain this. In the midst of battle, the greatest weakness of his ability was how long it took to communicate things. This was why it was so important to have Shadow Rat, who was unaffected by the darkness, Doubleshot, who could mark his target ahead of time and aim accordingly, and Manson, who could move on instinct. Together, they needed minimal communication even in the midst of such darkness. When Manson said 10 meters, that was about the only communication that would come from others to himself. When it came to those with high-level sensory abilities, Manson was the only one who could pinpoint their limits quickly. Yet, not only had Lionel dodged 2 bullets that were shot from outside his range, Shadow Rat had picked the time just after Lionel dodged to attack as well. Usually this was the perfect moment. But in practice this time he had walked right into a trap. That little mink. Why wasn't there any information about that little mink? The laziness of Panda's eyes vanished. He realized that he had to pull his domain down. This was the only way they would have a chance. However, he realized right then that his movements became sluggish. A mental coercion dulled his reflexes. All he could see were 2 floating orbs of violet hovering within the darkness, piercing into his soul. When time sped back up, he grabbed at his throat, the words he tried to speak coming out in a gurgle. He couldn't fathom how the old gentleman, a man known for his care and meticulousness, could possibly miss such an important detail. Not once had he mentioned this little mink. Not a single time. As Panda's vision darkened, he felt that at least it was good that his domain would fade away. That would give Manson a chance. Unfortunately, his last sight was of a little mink leaping down from his throat and tearing a hole through his chest, taking with him a shadow that somehow felt eerily familiar to him. He couldn't even think about what this meant before he collapsed completely dead. Lionel lightly tapped his foot, appearing before Doubleshot in a flash. The latter panicked. He couldn't see in the darkness like or Shadow Rat could, but his ability was a sensory type under the category of marksmanship. It allowed him to attach a marker to a given target that would give him information about their location, and give him the ability to aim toward them even with his eyes closed. Obviously, it was a low-level marking ability because it didn't have a homing ability, but it was still enough to tell that Lionel had suddenly gone from 50 meters from him to less than 5. Knowing where Lionel was, he was still able to aim and shoot. But how could Lionel be pinned down so easily? Lionel sidestepped once, sliding out of the way of the bullet the instant Doubleshot pulled the trigger. The latter, however, was still a veteran. Flipping the holster of his second gun, he aimed and prepared to fire, only to feel a piercing pain to his back. His hands trembled, his shot firing awry. Even though he couldn't see a thing, he didn't need to feel that gaping wound that now hung at his chest. He died? How? As had been said long ago, the best chance one would have at beating Lionel was on as neutral a ground as possible. The more variables you added, the more abilities you had, the greater advantage you thought you had grasped, the more likely you were to end up dead. Lionel turned toward Manson's location. All of this had occurred in just a few seconds. It seemed as though she was still waiting for Doubleshot and Shadow Rat to finish their probing strikes before she took action again. Those flashes of her death she had felt when she fought Lionel were firmly imprinted onto her heart. Even now, she was being as cautious as she could be, having no idea that 3 of her teammates had already died. Lionel calmly took out his sniper rifle, resting it on his shoulder. Now that Little Black Star had taken Panda's ability, he could feel Manson's presence with absolute ease, even without risking her sensing his internal sight. But at that moment, Manson's hair all stood on end. She suddenly felt that danger that had been to just one direction was coming from everywhere. The suffocating feeling of her death bore down on her from all sides. A bitter smile curled her lip. It seems that she was dead too. Lionel pulled the trigger, sliding back a meter beneath the recoil. Chapter 831. Lionel took deep, heavy breaths. As the domain faded and Little Black Star hopped back to his spot on his head, the last shards of sparkling crystals shattered and collapsed before the barrel of the sniper rifle. Firing with enough force to kill a Tier 2 fifth-dimensional expert was really almost too much for him. It wasn't even necessarily the light elemental force, but rather the construction of earth elemental force he needed to use. Lionel shook his head, his face a bit pale. He looked toward Manson's corpse, seeing the large hole through her heart. He could only say that he was quite lucky to have Little Black Star. The reason the old gentleman had never mentioned the little mink wasn't because he underestimated Black Star. This was a man who had spent precious moments poring over the footage for even the smallest detail. He would never forget to mention an odd little mink that seemed capable of sitting completely still even in the face of so many fifth-dimension experts. The real reason was because the old gentleman had never seen Little Black Star to begin with. Little Black Star liked to be in his incorporeal form. This form allowed him to continue to benefit from his shadow world, continuously growing stronger with every moment. When one was in the presence of Little Black Star, you could see him in this form, anyone could. You could even hear him should he choose to allow you to. The issue, though, was that cameras couldn't. Had the old gentleman questioned the miners under his charge, or those who had personally gone to the arena, they might have been able to tell him that Lionel was followed around by an odd little mink. However, how could he know to ask such a thing? Especially when time was already so tight. The result was the old gentleman being completely unaware of Little Black Star, leading to the group being caught completely off guard. Of course, it also helped that Little Black Star was already at the quasi-fifth-dimensional level. The little guy might not have had as much battle experience as Lionel or Aina, but he definitely had far more raw strength. When this was paired with Lionel directing him in battle, the duo wasn't to be trifled with. In fact, Lionel believed that he had almost neglected the little guy too much. Black Star was still an infant, yet he was growing so fast. If it wasn't for a cap in resources caused by Lionel's absence these last 2 years, the little guy would have already entered the fifth dimension. Lionel understood that he definitely needed to direct Black Star's growth with more purpose and caution. Lionel smiled lightly, scratching Black Star's little head. He tried to use his talisman, but once again, it didn't go through. Let's move from this place. That pandied man's ability won't be very useful to Little Black Star in the future. But it's decent for now. There were too many weaknesses to Panda's ability. If not, how could Lionel have dealt with it so easily? Had he not been saving his domain and his stamina, he could have blown that fake domain away, and anyone with a strong comprehension of universal cycles could do the same. The good news was that the ability was more powerful in Little Black Star's hands, but not enough to make it lamentable to give up in the future. Lionel gazed toward the corpses around him, and shook his head. Their abilities weren't worth taking either. With a flash, he disappeared down a corridor, finding another location to finish his ship. By this point, the planet was completely surrounded. Ships of massive proportion hung around in a silent orbit, all focused on a single task. They all understood their task well. Failure would not be allowed. The prestige of the Milky Way Guild was on the line. To fail to capture the young man that had so publicly slapped their faces would be a failure of epic proportion. It could not be allowed, and they all knew it. Within one of these ships, in a luxuriously decorated cabin, there was a different atmosphere. While the others might have been filled with a horrid weight, this one was filled with rivalry, youthful vigor, and most important, condescension. Even in death, that little bitch couldn't do anything right. First she brings home some fourth-dimensional piece of trash, and now she causes all of this trying to get revenge for him. I swear if I could, I would dig her up just to bury her again. The voice came from a snarky young woman wearing a fiery red dress. She would have had the elegance Era had when she was alive if it wasn't for the perpetual sneer that upturned her bright red lips. It was hard for one to decide whether they wanted a taste of her beauty, or if they would prefer to just punch her in the face. Her two elder brothers, though, didn't seem to want to correct the attitude of their little sister. In fact, the look between their brows seemed to suggest that they wholly agreed. This time, Era had really screwed them. The Milky Way Guild wasn't exactly in a precarious situation. In fact, they were stronger and more powerful than ever. The trouble was that any decline in all of history was almost invisible to those at the top. Their father, Guild Head Ovaltine, had drilled this into the minds since a very young age. The more powerful they were, the more the weak would want to band together to knock them down a peg. The only way to avoid this was by being so powerful that no one dared to do even that. Their father was on the verge of entering the sixth dimension. Once he did so, they would finally move forward with the next of their plans and bring the guild to a bigger stage. And yet, just when they were on the cusp of an even greater height, this happened. It was simply unacceptable. Chapter 832. Greta Ovaltine. As annoyed as the many guards of the Milky Way Guild were at the prospect of being assigned to Era in the last 2 years, it was less annoyance and more dread when the target of protection was Greta. As abrasive as she was now at a seemingly unique situation, she seemed to find any number of reasons to act like this on a day-by-day basis. If it wasn't Era who became her living, or rather dead target, it would have been someone or something else, without a doubt. However, there wasn't much that could be done about this. Greta, unlike Era, was a great talent valued by Guild Head Ovaltine. It might seem from the situation in the luxurious holding room of the flying ship that there were only 4 Ovaltine siblings, especially with how they ragged on the now-deceased Era, but this couldn't have been further from the truth. Guild Head Ovaltine had just one wife, but dozens of women he frequented. Unfortunately for those women, frequented was the best word to be used to describe their relationship, as the guild head never gave them any status. Not even a lesser title like concubine. Of the 3 siblings here, only the eldest among them, Tobin Ovaltine, a young man whose standout feature were his blazing green eyes, was from the only wife of the guild head. The other 2, including Greta, were from these frequented women. It could be said that the only thing somewhat special about Era was that she, too, was birthed from the guild head's wife. But it was also because of this that she gained an extra hint of spiciness from Greta's ire. The truth of the matter wasn't as one might expect. The guild head didn't only marry a single woman for the sake of showing some symbolic loyalty to her. In fact, it could be said that the guild head's wife, Emera Ovaltine, was a dime a dozen. She had delicate and beautiful looks, even as she entered the later stages of her life. Her talent was decent, having entered the 5th dimension, and even having reached its higher tiers, but having no chance at entering the 6th. Her family background was not too weak, but also not too strong. If she had to be described, she was akin to a trophy in a display case, but one that could easily be glossed over in favor of the larger trophies sharing the same shelf. The reason Augustus Ovaltine chose her was because she ticked just enough boxes without ticking too many. As for why he had done this, people had their own speculations. But maybe only Augustus himself knew the truth. All that mattered to his children, though, was that even if Emera's role was just superficial and lacking in weight, the children she birthed, 2 to be exact, would still given this same respect, albeit also superficial and lacking in substance. Era, simply by virtue of who she was born to, might not have been able to hold any true power in her life, but at the very least, she wouldn't have to bite, scratch and claw for every chance she was given. She could live a life of leisure and without worry. There would always be as much wealth as she could spend, as much food as she could eat, as much entertainment as she could consume. She would never be wanting for anything. Isn't that why Greta resented her so much? Even with her talent, how many piles of bullshit did she have to crawl out of just to stand here? But to Greta, that was just the tip of the iceberg. What made her truly resent Era was that the bitch didn't seem satisfied with what she was given. She started to fight and jockey for position with the rest of them as though she had to. And the methods she chose made Greta feel as though her skin was crawling. She was so weak, so frail, but just her face irritated Greta to an extreme. And yet, unlike with everything else that pissed her off, Greta couldn't just punch a hole through Era, or else everything she had worked to build up would come crumbling down. Greta would never admit it to herself, but, even in death, she could still see Era's elegant bearing, the noble air of her gait, the perfect measure of her smile. She was a woman who was refined down to the last detail. Even though she might have been weak, when it came to matters of character and intelligence, and even looks, she was perfect beyond compare. And what was even more infuriating was that she had almost succeeded. Was if that fourth-dimensional trash of her really managed to conquer Earth? Wouldn't they all have to bow at her feet? To be born with something she couldn't have like status, Greta could accept. But to be born with such a thing and still be superior to her, that Greta could not accept. The only thing that infuriated her about Era's death was that she couldn't do it herself. As enraged as Greta was, though, Rollo had long since gotten over the fact he was lesser born, and didn't hate Era nearly as much. Maybe a part of that was due to the fact Era was a woman, and he felt ridiculous being jealous of a little sister of his as a grown man. But what he did know was that he didn't like this situation at all. Tobin would be just fine regardless. But failure on Greta and his part would likely mean years of work, just to return to the favorable light they had right now. It was like suddenly being met with a pop exam that was worth 90% of your grade all, because someone you hardly knew was snarky with the teacher. How could he not be pissed? Regardless, this was just the life of the child of a frequented woman. He had long since become used to having to prove himself day in and day out. Suddenly loud blaring noises sounded as a ship rocketed out of the atmosphere. The siblings raised an eyebrow simultaneously. What an idiot! Shoot it down and let's go home, Tobin said carelessly. His words hardly fell when beams of energy fell from all sides. Such strength! It could turn a fifth-dimensional moon to rubble. Chapter 833. The moment the small ship was locked onto by several behemoths, as though a rock out of a slingshot, its acceleration suddenly doubled. Sparks and explosions rang through the quickly thinning atmosphere, and yet they only seemed to propel the small ship faster as it squirted out of their encirclement. The lights were so bright and the ship was so tiny in proportion to everything else that it was immediately assumed that the operation was successful. But if it was so easy to fool such high tech, why would the guild have ever invested however many billions they had to build them? However, what left the siblings at a loss for words was that the moment the ship used the momentum around it to shoot by the last thinning layers of the atmosphere, runic patterns exuding a magnificent aura bloomed like a halo. At first, the runes were etched right onto its sleek silver surface. But in the next, they became animated, wiggling about as though life had been breathed into them. They rose from the surface, forming a protective disk of flickering silver that grew brighter and brighter, until it rivaled even the second barrage of beams headed right for its small frame. Tobin's eyes widened. Retreat. Execute evasive maneuvers now. Very few seemed to understand the purpose behind Tobin's orders, but their job wasn't to understood. Even though some of the guild heads' children saw themselves as less than, any one of them that was known to have such a connection wouldn't be easily crossed. On top of this, Tobin wasn't like them. He was born from the head's legitimate wife. His orders were even less likely to be ignored. It wouldn't be long, though, before they realized that Tobin had saved all their lives. The rippling silver runes reached an unspeakable peak, touching upon a level of brightness that seemed to rival the sun in the distance. And then, everything seemed to collapse. A black hole that was of miniature proportion and devastating impact ripped through the fold of reality. The orbit of the planet was shaken, tilted off its axis. The moons in the distance were warped, threatening to be slinged into the ether as they trembled to maintain the path they had followed for billions of years. And the ships that had once surrounded them all fell into chaos. Some of the ships were simply too close. Their front hulls were smashed to pieces, warped beneath the twisting space. What once were behemoth-like ships the size of large asteroids suddenly became scrap metal. Sparks flew and blood floated through the air. Whether by irony or simply as a display of the cruelty of this world, the latter was nothing more than fleeting droplets amidst the carnage, the much larger ship parts making them difficult to even notice. The ships that were further away were a bit luckier, but the result was still them losing control of their steering. The end was devastating. Some of the ships plunged toward planet Vincero below, painting what looked like beautiful swirls of white, green and blue from the outside with heart-trembling explosions and the blood-curdling sounds of groaning and whining metal. Some of the ships were flung out of their orbit, drifting into the depths of space with off-kilter propulsion that wrestled and fought against their control. But the most devastating were 3 ships that crashed headlong into one another. The resulting devastation was even more furious than that of the ships that had been too close. At least in the latter case, it ended as soon as it started. But in this one it seemed to continue into infinity. Whenever the explosions had seemingly come to a stop, another chain was let off. The skies were filled with fireworks and smoke, but it wasn't the kind one could enjoy on a National Independence Day. Rather, it was the kind that made one's ears bleed, one's gaze dazed, and etched their minds with the memory of every shake and tremble they experienced. Many years later, when this matter became a case study for the history books, it would become known that the Milky Way Guild had suffered such devastating losses targeting a ship that didn't even have their target on board. In fact, the ship wasn't related to their target in the slightest. On board the silver ship, tunneling through space to a location unknown, one could find 3 women. One wore a stoic expression, taking control of the steering before passing it on to an AI. The second wore a look of confusion, seemingly wondering how it is she had gotten caught in this mess while her heart was lodged in her throat. And the last was in a daze, blankly staring at something on her wrist without a word. In fact, from her demeanor, it seemed that she might not speak for a very, very long time. And maybe if you pried into her mind, you would find that she might not have had the intention of speaking ever again. Who else could these 3 be if not Yuri, Savon and Aina? It was quite an irony that an action Lionel could very well abhor with all his heart and soul, had all but guaranteed his safety. What no one realized, though, was that half a day later, it wasn't only a small ship that covertly slipped through the cracks left by the Guild's defenses. There was another protected vessel that seemed to have been doing the same. And oddly enough, these 2 left from completely different ends of planet Vincero, and headed in direction opposite to each other. The first held Lionel, who was shocked by the ease of his escape. He had been certain that he would need to use almost all of the trump cards he had planned. Had he known things would be like this, he could have left within the first hour. As for the second, the vessel meandered through space. It looked like a small glass orb traveling through the darkness, not being even half the width of a palm. Obviously, it was impossible for it to hold a person, and its speed was on a level that put Lionel's own vessel to shame. Weeks later, this vessel descended onto an obscure, desolate planet. It tore into the almost non-existent atmosphere, following a path into a hole so small even a fist couldn't fit down, and through an elaborate set of complex and steadily widening tunnels that looked more and more man-made with every trek forward. And then, it appeared in a large lab setting covered wall-to-wall in silver metals, complex glassware, and thick, forearm-sized wires, all of which could be found in one aspect or another upon the centerpiece of the whole thing. It was a large tube, filled with fluid up to the very brim. Around it, 3 men and women sat monitoring it, their expressions serious. When they noticed the vessel, they sighed a breath of relief. It seemed that everything had been successful. They could finally begin. Though they knew and understood the ability of their patron, The logistics of this mission had seemed far too complex to accomplish. But none of that mattered. In the end they had succeeded. The vessel entered a special compartment, finding itself floating with the glass tube, along with the body of the half-naked girl that hovered within. The moment the vessel touched this girl, a light pulse rippled and she opened her eyes. The three men and women smiled as the young woman stepped out, her body dripping with thick, viscous liquid. Welcome back, Miss Era. Important announcement below April 28, 2022. Chapter 834. Era's body and hair dripped with the thick, light blue liquid. Two women quickly stepped forward, helping her to dry off and slip a robe onto her shoulders. The liquid was a bit difficult to work with usually, but it was clear that they had long since been prepared for this. Era remained silent for a long while, but none of the three said a word to rush her. After all, she had just experienced her own death. It would take some time for anyone to become used to such a thing. The fact she wasn't having a visible mental breakdown was already enough of a testament to her fortitude. It could be said that Era's ability was quite unique and fell under the Soul Manipulation Ability Index. The existence of this ability was exactly why many referred to Soul Force as such, despite the fact it would usually be more accurately described as a mental force or pressure. Despite Lionel's talent, he had never seen any sort of manifestation of his soul. He didn't see any miniature version of himself, nor could he find a center of his consciousness. As far as he knew, there was no tangible form of the soul, or at the very least, there wasn't one for his. Era, though, was different. Those with her ability were capable of not only seeing this form, but also making use of it. As for the ability index itself, it too was split into 5 levels: seed, root, form, manipulation, immortality. The first seed levels refers to the most immature form of the soul. It is a step beyond what most would have, and is usually available to only those with either this ability, are from a special race, or have a special lineage factor. At the second level, this seed takes root. This represents a growth in the soul's strength, and also an increase in its sturdiness and durability. Finally, at the third level, the root takes form. The most common form is a representation of the person, usually a smaller, more ethereal image of the body. However, this doesn't always have to be the case, especially for those who reach the 4th level. Upon reaching manipulation, not only can the form of the soul be changed, but it can now exist completely independent of the body without penalty. One who has touched this 4th level could live just as long as they would with a body as they would without one. Finally, immortality, reserved for savants. At this stage, the soul gains a lifespan as long as the planets and the stars. Even if the body decays and wilts, the soul will last far beyond this. No one is sure if this is true immortality or not, but what is guaranteed is that you will far outlive those of your dimension, and even higher dimensions. All of this mostly explained the form the soul would take at each stage, but otherwise, it seemed like a useless ability unless you could reach the 4th or 5th levels. But this is far from the case. Those with the Soul Manipulation Ability Index have many abilities outside of taking control of their souls. They are more intelligent than most, they are more perceptive and sensitive, their senses are otherworldly, and when paired with the right techniques, their soul, thanks to added durability compared to others, could display quite devastating prowess. Meeting someone with a soul manipulation ability, who also had the techniques to pair with them, was amongst the bravest things a person could ever do. Era had reached the 3rd level, the form stage. At this level, her soul couldn't exist indefinitely without a body like it would be able to at the 4th level, but it could still last several months to even years without one. This had given her more than enough time to make it to this lab, and take over this vessel that had been prepared for her. This vessel was actually a clone of her original body with its face modified just enough that those familiar with her wouldn't be able to recognize her. The issue with clones is that they had short lifespans and were usually far different in personality from the person they had been cloned from. But they weren't difficult to prepare. After all, even the people of 21st century Earth, a mere 3rd-dimensional land, could accomplish this. So, how could Era not with the resources of the Milky Way Guild? That said, The issues clones faced were all erased when it was paired with a soul manipulation ability. As long as her soul was intact, Era could do this as many times as she pleased. In fact, you've made this body to my specifications? Yes, Miss Era. We spared no expense. The weaknesses of your former body are no longer present. This body has the strength of someone at the peak of the 5th dimension, and we've also given it the light elemental innate node Miss requested. Which light elemental innate node? Era asked. We weren't able to procure anything high level. Integrating an innate node into a clone proved to be far more difficult than we thought. It is only an unranked light elemental innate node. I see. Era seemed neither disappointed nor happy about this. Though it was hard to tell if this was because she didn't care one way or another, or if it was because she was still getting used to using the facial muscles of her new body. Preparing powerful clones like this had been a technology available for thousands of years already in the Milky Way. Probably even longer than that when the scope of the entire dimensional verse was taken into account. The issue was that it was far too expensive for a soldier that would only last a year if you were lucky. It could be said that Era's ability was simply perfect to take advantage of this, and was quite reminiscent of a certain special race of people who built their own bodies after birth. Good. Era clenched and unclenched her fists. What's happened in my absence? Chapter 835. So he survived. Era's voice carried a level of monotony that bordered on robotic. If it wasn't for the fact her voice flowed smoothly, it would be easy to mistake her for an AI. But as time passed, she seemed to warm up, not toward a happier emotion, but rather just toward feelings in general. We cannot be sure, Mississippi. According to our analysis, the flying ship that caused the commotion originated from the main base. However, the last sighting of Lionel Morales was at mining site 102A where the corpses of Drunken Kicks, Shadow Rat, Doubleshot, and were all found. We have cause to believe that the flying ship did not have Lionel Morales on it. But planet Vincero was thrown into chaos soon afterward. So it is impossible to tell if he is still on the surface or if he has long since left. He has left. Era confirmed expressionlessly. The three scientists looked toward one another, but didn't bother to ask for an explanation. They had been working with Era for long enough to know that she would provide an answer if she wanted to. If not, there was no use in asking. Era took a deep breath and her body suddenly relaxed. In what felt like an instant, her usual demeanor had returned. The subtle elegance of her movements, the intelligent twinkle of her eye, the calming rhythm of her breath. As though something had snapped back into place, her personality was back. Took a bit longer than expected. Era shook her head. That isn't all that happened, right? Right. Greta Ovaltine and Rollo Ovaltine have suffered quite some backlash due to their failure. Second, the 4 organizations who had participated have returned to their territories, but have entered a state of near seclusion. Their movements are limited, and much of the movement that there is has been turned finding Lionel Morales. Thirdly, the old gentleman seems to have havoc in hand as expected. It seems that he still feels as though there is a piece of the puzzle he is missing. Era nodded. That old man has always been sharp. If not for this, he wouldn't be put in charge of such an important asset. However, it doesn't matter how sharp he is if he doesn't have enough information. Miss, is it safe to trust that Havoc merchant? It doesn't matter, Era said without care. He too doesn't have enough information to make a change. One way or another, the Milky Way Guild will fall to its knees before me. Did Era love Anared, her late fiancé? The answer was yes. But the reason why might be surprising to most. Those with the soul manipulation ability were incredibly sensitive. They experienced emotions at a much higher high than most, and were natural empaths. Era originally saw Anared as a light along a path toward her ultimate goal. However, that easily blossomed into a true infatuation, very quickly. It didn't help that Anared's feelings for her were as clear as if she could read a book on his thoughts. To her, the death of Anared was both the loss of a loved one and a setback that ruined plans she had been laying for decades. Still, she was Era Ovaltine. Failure was something she had long since become accustomed to. The truth was that she hadn't expected to die in this way. Though she had assigned a small probability to it, it could be said that Lionel had surprised her once again, something he had quite the habit of doing. But she still felt that this outcome was even better than the one she had planned. It was so surprising and out of left field that no one would even have an inkling that she had staged it. That made it perfect. I'll kill him soon enough. But in this case, I have to thank him. I'm one step closer to overthrowing that so-called father of mine. Things would have been easiest if she could have Earth in her back pocket. Had she succeeded, it would have only been a matter of time before the Guild Council would be completely on her side. However, she felt that this method might taste even sweeter than her original plans. It took Lionel even longer than it had Era to reach a planet he could disembark upon. Unfortunately, he had invested most of his craft's utility in escaping the immediate surroundings of planet Vincero. This was why he leaned so heavily into wind elemental ores. He had been planning on making use of the volatile winds to give him an added boost the people the Milky Way Guild wouldn't be able to match. What he hadn't known at the time was that there wouldn't be any of the defensive nets he had been expecting to find. In fact, there was nothing at all. He soared away from the planet, as though he was on a simple commute. When Lionel managed to land on this mostly uninhabited planet, he didn't even step out of his ship. Instead, he took out his communication talisman and began to modify it with his crafting quill. By now, he felt that Aina should be back on planet Valiant. So, using the connection already established between the two talismans, he would teleport to her location. This would also help just in case they were someplace unexpected. That way he wouldn't make a trip without reason. Aina's half already had a built-in protective measure that would alert and send him over should someone other than her use it. So piggybacking off of this mechanism wasn't difficult. I should hide the fluctuations and maybe add some concealment on the other end. It would be pretty ridiculous if I teleported over just to be chased again. In a rented room of a restaurant, a heated debate that had been going on for weeks already was still raging on. It most definitely didn't help that there wasn't a single ounce of estrogen in sight. From what could be seen, no one would expect that these were a group of brothers that had been together for ages. We can't do that. I still think we should just tell him she went to see her dad, and we'll be back. You want to lie to him? It's not lying. It's the truth. When in her words did she say she would be back? Why are you defending that woman? I'm not defending her. But she clearly had her own reasons. I don't care what the reasons are, they're all bullshit. We need to tell Cap the truth. Another volley of testosterone-filled insults and roars was about to be levied when an amused voice suddenly and easily cut through it all. Its volume wasn't even particularly loud, and yet it caused them all to turn their gaze toward the very same location. Tell me the truth about what? Lionel appeared with a smile, canceling his concealment since it didn't seem to be necessary. His gaze drifted across the room before it landed on the table. A stack of objects immediately caught his attention, causing his smile to freeze and slowly fade. Chapter 836. Cap. The voices all called out in unison, drowning out even the volume they had been arguing at before. And yet, Lionel didn't seem to hear them. His gaze was expressionlessly locked onto the items on the table. The segmented cube. The blue-veined mask. The talisman. The necklace. His eyes almost carelessly swept through them all, his expression giving nothing away. Still, it was as though he was standing in a parallel dimension, a space he shared with the items on the table. He couldn't see, hear or even smell anything else. The floor beneath his feet might as well have been nothing, but an endless void he was free-falling through. The room fell into silence when they noticed the direction of Lionel's gaze. They all suddenly felt that it was ridiculous that they had been debating this topic for so long, only for Lionel to see through it all due to a slight carelessness. They could have never expected that Lionel would suddenly appear in this fashion. Even if they had wanted to hide the items, they never had a chance to. Cap. Joel stood from his position, approaching Lionel. None of them had ever seen Lionel get emotional. Even when he felt rage, he would instead enter a state of coldness that made even them uncomfortable. These group of brothers had been together for more than 10 years, not including the time they had spent apart. They had grown together. from the time they were 5 years old, putting on their first football pads, to the time they were all 17-year-old seniors. As long as they had played together, they had, of course, lost their fair share of games. However, not a single one of them could ever remember losing when Lionel got like this. It was as though they were all forced into a hyper-tense state, their minds and bodies on full alert like they were awaiting orders. Joel stood before Lionel, but the latter seemed to look right through him. It was the most uncomfortable Joel had ever felt in his lifetime. Lionel didn't divert his gaze, he didn't crane his neck or tilt his head to the side. In fact, Joel felt as though a hole was being torn through his throat. "Is that everything?" Lionel spoke. His voice didn't seem to carry much hurt. In fact, it was quite soothing. It was the kind of voice one could listen to when falling asleep. Lionel's voice wasn't normally like so. It wasn't too deep nor was it too high. It had a mellow carefreeness to it that drew those around him in. But at this moment, the soothing nature masked a sort of coercion that demanded an answer. It was the kind of question anyone hearing it was compelled to answer, the kind of question they couldn't lie in answer of even if they tried. "Yes, that's everything." Joel responded. "I see." Lionel fell into silence and the room followed suit. The eyes of all his teammates focused on him, worry marring their brows. However, none of them spoke a single word. They knew that at this moment, nothing would get through to Lionel, as he stepped into his own world. It was just like it had been in the beginning. He wouldn't even be able to hear them. And they were exactly right. Within Lionel's dream world, a dream clone of himself stood. Before this dream clone sat a golden balance. On one side of the balance, there was a near-perfect replica of Aina, but it was possible to see right through it. On the other, there was a perfect replica of Lionel that could also be seen right through. Lionel's dream clone waved a hand. Replicas of the blue-veined mask, the talisman, the necklace and the segmented cube manifested, falling onto Aina's side. The golden balance shifted, falling heavily to one side. A booming noise reverberated through the white walls of the dream world, sending wave after wave of trembling sounds in every which direction. However, Lionel's dream clone hardly reacted, even as the heart of Aina's replica fell. Grasping at hair, the dream clone began to form motes of light. After each one of these motes was formed, they would gently float to the side of Lionel's replica. Lionel grasped at air, forming another mote of light. Within, an image of him first meeting Aina played. One could see her short-cut hair and shy smile. Lionel lightly tossed it forward before forming another. Within this one you could find his first ever confession to Aina. One would have thought that her first reaction would have been that flustered runaway everyone had become used to. But Lionel's recollection was different. That day, she beamed a smile so bright it was etched onto his heart forever. It was only after that she seemed to panic and run away. Lionel tossed the mote of light forward. The balance shifted slightly, but it wasn't nearly enough to balance things once more. One after another, the motes of light continued to build. Every memory, every emotion, every first time, every experience. However, even after the last memory landed, the balance hadn't been balanced. Lionel stood expressionlessly. There were no memories left. He had placed down everything from the 7 years he had known Aina. Yet, all of it wasn't enough to outweigh those 4 items. At that moment, it was almost as though scissors hovered above Lionel's heart, ready to snip at something that had been with him for what felt like a lifetime. However, just as the shimmering blades glistened, prepared to snap close, a memory hovered into Lionel's view, dancing upon the side of his replica. It was an image of Lionel kneeling on all fours over Aina's body. The bottom of her legs had been blown off, charred beyond recognition. His own face was covered in soot and grime, rage painting his expression. Without a word, Lionel's hand grasped at air once again. This time, it wasn't a memory that formed but rather an item. Compared to the other items, it was shabby and even cracked in multiple places. And yet it weighed heavily in Lionel's hand. It was a bracelet, a mere C-grade treasure. Lionel tossed it forward. When it landed, the balance trembled, finally shifting until both platforms were perfectly level. Chapter 837. Aina sat in silence, having not moved in the weeks they had been on this spacecraft. Despite her usually large appetite, she hadn't eaten anything. And completely out of character, she hadn't lifted a single finger to practice or train. She simply sat there, staring at her wrist the same way she had been for ages already. On it an old cracked bracelet lay. She couldn't drum up the courage to hand it over with everything else. She convinced herself that Lionel didn't need it. After all, he had so many valuable things, right? He wouldn't miss a C-grade treasure, right? It would be fine if she kept it, it wouldn't be a big deal. He's probably already forgotten about its existence. Aina blinked, causing a discomfort to surge through her body. The dryness of her eyes almost made her feel as though something was scraping along them, making her shiver. Aina, you need to rest. Savon tried to convince Aina to take a rest again. She had lost count of the number of times she had tried already. Even for someone within the fourth dimension, it most definitely wasn't healthy to remain awake for so long. Even Lionel, who had dream force within the fifth dimension, still felt the need to sleep at least once a week, let alone Aina, whose soul force was only in the fourth dimension. Before Aina could once again give her a perfunctory answer about being just fine, Yuri's force suddenly surged. Aina couldn't react before she found her eyes closing involuntarily. Ah! Savon reached her arms out and caught Aina before she could slump out of her seat. The ship didn't have a lot of space. There was Yuri up ahead who took the helm, and there was just enough space for about 4 people to sit facing each other in pairs toward the back. The seat could also recline to allow a decent sleeping experience, and there was a compartment in the back with plenty of preserved food. Savon helped put Aina's seat into a reclined position and let her sleep. She couldn't help but sigh under her breath. She had witnessed a lot of breakups in her lifetime. After all, she had once been a high school student. But this clearly felt like it was something beyond that. Unfortunately, she didn't have any personal experience in such matters. She had never fallen for a man, so she didn't understand any of what Aina was experiencing. But she still couldn't wrap her mind around it all. If it hurt you so much, why did you do it at all? We will be crossing from a 5th-dimensional fold of reality into a 6th-dimensional fold very soon. Yuri's voice came from the front. You should prepare yourself. The jump from 5th to 6th is the largest you will have experienced until this point. You might even feel like you're back to being a normal mortal. Whether you can adapt or not will decide if you have a future ahead of you, or if the 5th dimension will be your limit. Yuri explained this nice and succinctly. Do you want me here, Yuri? Savon spoke after a long pause. In fact, it had been so long that Yuri had thought she didn't have to expect a response at all. But the content of the question was even more shocking. The circumstances that led to Savon being here were quite unique. Aina had been clinging to her to the point of refusing to let go. As a result, Yuri had no choice but to propose a deal to Savon. That deal was quite simple. It was an opportunity to step into the broader world and experience the dimensional verse in a way she never had before. Compared to a middling bronze organization, the place they were going was not just a single step above. Savon wasn't sure how to answer initially. She wasn't drunk for power, she didn't really have anything to strive for, and she had no family left. If she were to answer why she had said yes and chosen to come, it wasn't due to the enticement of Yuri's offer, but rather because Savon just didn't want to be alone anymore. She wanted that sisterhood the 3 of them had had before, but she felt like it was less and less likely with every day that passed. Do you think I hate you? Yuri countered. Savon didn't really know how to respond. She didn't think she was hated. It was just that these 2 had shared a secret that she wasn't privy to. It was like finding out you were the 3rd wheel in a relationship formed for 2. If she was honest, this was a good portion of the reason she had pulled away as well. The irony of it all, though, was that back then, she had drawn a line between herself, Aina, and Yuri because Aina killed Conrad so viciously. But Aina had done that for Lionel's sake. And now, it was a matter between Aina and Lionel that once again brought them together. Savon, I am a child that Miss Aina's father adopted. I have an obligation to protect her above all else. However, none of this means that I never saw you as a friend. Savon was stunned into silence, not knowing how to respond. But her gaze glistened with unshed tears, her lips curling into a slight smile. Thank you, Yuri. What are you thanking me for? I need some support to deal with the Miss Mood swings. The two girls giggled, crossing through the depths of space with a small bit of warmth. All right. Lionel's gaze regained their focus as he smiled lightly, patting Joel's shoulder. What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost. Cap. Joel didn't know how to respond to this. 1 second, Lionel was completely expressionless. And in the next, he was smiling warmly. What the hell was going on? Oh, it looks like everyone's here. That's good. Lionel suddenly released a fiendish grin. How about we stir up some trouble? Chapter 838. Cap. You're alright? Lionel blinked. Why wouldn't I be? Joel was speechless. He knew that Lionel's EQ wasn't this low. Was he just pretending? Or did that brain of his finally short-circuit? He didn't even know how to respond to all of this. Lionel smiled knowingly but didn't say anything else. The way his own logic worked wasn't something that he wanted to take the time to explain. The number of calculations, one part rigorous, and another part arbitrary, that went into his final decision was so large that he would have to be here all day if these guys insisted on him explaining it all. To make matters worse, they might not even understand and assume that he was simply forgiving Aina because he was lovesick, when he was probably the only person in this world who wouldn't be guilty of such a thing. Did Aina's actions hurt? Of course they did. Did Lionel understand why she had done so? He understood that as well. He knew that Aina had abandonment issues. He knew that she suffered severely from panic attacks and anxiety. It was because of this that he didn't want to look at her during those final moments. As much as he cared for her, he simply couldn't ignore the life and death of his brothers for the sake of her emotions, right? It was harsh when he put it that way, but it was the truth. Maybe Lionel's greatest disappointment was that he had left Aina behind expressly, so that she could protect his teammates from anything unexpected. Yet, from what it seemed like here, she had left before they were in the clear. The irony of it all wasn't lost on him in the slightest. The second greatest disappointment was that she didn't believe he could come back alive. That lack of trust stung almost as much as anything else. It stung so much that Lionel knew he had made those memories far lighter than they should have been. He had told Aina a long time ago that the one thing he would never tolerate was her losing trust in him. This time, she was barely within a threshold he could accept. If there was a next time, though, the golden balance might be even harsher than it was this time around. Either way, the best-case scenario right now was to pretend as though nothing had happened. At least that way, the boys would think that he just didn't want to talk about the topic and avoid it. He knew that they had likely said their fair share of harsh words about Aina in his absence, but since he had already made his decision for now, he didn't feel that that should continue. And truthfully, even if his decision had landed on the other side, rather than constantly hearing about how terrible she was, he would prefer if all thoughts of her were simply frozen out. What trouble are you trying to stir up, Cap? Joel asked, seemingly realizing something. Since this was what Lionel wanted, who were they to not oblige? After all, it wasn't their relationship, and it wasn't they who had invested so many years of their youth into it. Lionel grinned, scanning the room. Right now, there were far more than the 4 that had come as seeded geniuses. Though many of his teammates had died during the metamorphosis, it seemed that 8 still remained. He couldn't help but feel genuinely happy seeing all their faces like this. Joel. Yes. If I said that I want us to rise to the top of the dimensional verse and stake our control over it all, what would you say? Joel's eyes glowed. All nervousness he had felt about Lionel's demeanor vanished with the wind. His back snapped straight and his chest broadened. One could almost feel the sharp aura of his ability whistling around him, leaving blade streaks in the air. Was this it? Looking into Lionel's pale violet eyes, he could see purpose, ambition, determination. It wasn't as though he had never seen the last of the 3 in Lionel before, but they had always been aimed toward short-term goals. This was the first time he had ever seen the first 2 aim toward something other than Aina. If the team had to pick out their greatest fear in this whole ordeal, it wasn't in the fact Aina was leaving Lionel at all. Objectively speaking, they had always believed that Lionel could do better. And, even with how beautiful Aina had become, wouldn't it be too ridiculous if she was the only being with that level of beauty throughout the whole dimensional verse? With their captain's qualifications, why wouldn't he be able to find another? No. What they had feared the most was that without Aina, the man they all respected and admired so much would suddenly become aimless once again. An arrow with untold power flying toward an endless abyss without target. But now Joel began to laugh. His boisterous laughter was even fuller and rounder than Lionel's own. His dark skin almost glowed with an aura of its own. Even Lionel was slightly surprised to see that Joel had suddenly gained a slight violet tint to his energy that most definitely came from Lionel himself. Looking around the room, Lionel found 7 more grinning faces looking back at him, each one of taking a portion of Lionel's violet energy for himself. A warmth couldn't help but bloom in Lionel's heart. They hadn't asked any questions, they didn't want to know how or why. They simply took the leap because they trusted him. And for Lionel's violet energy to react on its own, taking it upon itself to share his king's might with them all, that could only mean one thing. Lionel trusted them unconditionally. These were his brothers for a lifetime. These were the warriors that would stand by his side to the very end. These were his generals. Chapter 839. Joel, Milan, Raj, Drake, Franco, Arnold, Gil, Alan. Author's note: no need to remember these names. I'll mention them so often in the future, and with small reminders of who they are that they'll become your brothers too. El Mayo. Are you sure about this, Cap? Joel asked. After what happened on planet Vincero, even though we're talented compared to their normal students, they're pretty much drawing a line between us and them. Something like taking them over from the inside would be difficult with how cautious they're being. The group nodded in confirmation. Even while they were here, they were likely being monitored by someone or something. The only reason they weren't worried enough to warn Lionel was because they were sure that he wasn't stupid enough to come here without any sort of plan or counter to that. That said, Lionel's next words made them question themselves. Oh right. Speaking of which, where are we right now? The group looked toward Lionel as though he was a madman. He had just escaped the pursuit of fifth-dimensional entities, and it could even be argued that the only reason he managed to do so was because of the element of surprise. Now, however, whoever came to track him down would be prepared, and likely even more informed about all his abilities. He wouldn't just be able to wiggle his way out of this again so casually. The fact he didn't even know where they were currently was a huge red flag. But seeing how careless he seemed about it all, they were too speechless to reprimand him. This is an allied planet, Cap. Gil spoke out. Gil was Lionel's favorite receiver outside of James when they were on the football field. Rather than playing tight end like James, though, he played wide receiver. And in fact, he was the one who caught the game-winning touchdown in the final play after coach subbed James out in a rage. He was a tall man, only an inch or two shorter than Lionel. But he was quite lanky. In truth, his body composition and poor posture was eerily reminiscent of Hephaestus. It was just that Lionel knew quite well that Gil wasn't nearly as jacked as Hephaestus was. He had always said muscle training messed up his hand-eye coordination. Allied? Lionel blinked. He had never heard this term before. Yeah. A lot of worlds are under joint ownership like this. They also double as pretty good entertainment centers and trade hubs. After this, we should definitely hit the strip club. Gil's usually lanky and lazy appearance lit up when he reached this point. Lionel had wondered why the usually laid-back brat had so graciously decided to explain things to him. It seemed that this was his purpose all along. In their group, it could be said that the second biggest pervert outside of James was definitely Gil. Who knew how many hearts he had broken in Royal Blue Academy with that casually handsome face of his. That 5 o'clock shadow he could never bother to shave completely off, and his swooping dirty blonde hair left those poor girls not standing a chance. Lionel chuckled. Maybe later. Ah. Gil almost leapt from his seat. Did someone take over your body, Cap? Let me check. Gil almost leapt across the table, expressing his shock in the most ridiculous of ways. But he couldn't get very far before Franco palmed him in the face. Seemingly knowing exactly what was going to happen next, Arnold, who sat between the two of them, put a hand to both of their chests, keeping them apart. Are you trying to go, elephant ears? Gil snapped, his sharp nose leaking droplets of blood. Can't you see there's food on the table, Quasimodo? I don't want your BO stinking up my meal. Gil and Franco had a love-hate relationship. While Gil played wide receiver, Franco played cornerback, the latter of which was meant to defend against the former. It could be said that they were at war during every practice. One would think that they were enemies rather than teammates. Franco was quite known for his overly large body parts. He had big feet, big hands, and big ears. Somehow, it all came together for him in a pretty nice package. At the very least, he wasn't ugly. But that wouldn't stop Gil from going at him. Ironically, Arnold, who had stopped the two of them, had pretty much the same relationship with Milan due to on-the-field stuff. Arnold's gut was just as big as Milan's and his chest and arms were just as solid and robust. The palms of his hands were probably even bigger than Franco's, completely stopping the two men from leaping at one another. This was quite helpful to Arnold. After all, he played defensive tackle while Milan played center. Their battles during practice were quite infamous as well. Lionel watched all of this with a smile on his face. How long had it been? It seemed that in his obsession with Aina, he had neglected his brothers. The fact they weren't blaming him now when he knew they had every right to do so only made him affirm his resolve to not forget them again. Of course, we can go later. Lionel laughed. No, Cap, for real. Did someone mess with your head? The entire group looked over. Since when would Lionel ever agree to go to a strip club? This time, though, it was Alan who slapped the back of Gil's head. It was obvious to him that Lionel was just trying to get over Aina. Why were you asking so many questions about it? Lionel chuckled and shook his head. I once read somewhere that the places people are most vulnerable and open is a place like a brothel or a strip club. I wonder how much information is hidden in those walls. The group blinked as they looked at Lionel. Gil rubbed the back of his head, glaring at Alan. But even he stopped and looked at Lionel when he heard this explanation. Go to the strip club for information? Right. Chapter 840. Cap, it's okay for you to join the ranks of us perverts. I won't judge you. Lionel laughed at their reaction. He had been mostly joking. He didn't need much information right now. Or, more accurately, there wasn't any information that he could suddenly receive from going to a strip club right this moment that wouldn't be like a pie falling from the sky. Lionel knew that the likelihood he would find something useful in such a case was minimal, if anything. Rather, he only put forward the idea because he had something else on his mind. An information network. During his time battling Alexander the Apex's kingdom, Lionel had long since learned the value of not only having information, but subverting your enemy's information as well. The trouble with all of this was that even Lionel wasn't exactly sure where to start with all of this. As things stood now, he had 9 subordinates. His 8 brothers here and Elther, who he had already sent to take control of the Oryx, a task that shouldn't be too difficult for him to accomplish. But an information network, especially one that would need to cover the whole of a galaxy, at the very least, was far beyond his current self. The logical answer would be to make use of information networks that already existed. Lionel was sure that he would find multiple. But the trouble with those information networks is that their confidentiality only extended as far as their benefits did. If Lionel started purchasing large sums of information related to the rise and fall of great powers, not to mention the fact he didn't have the funds to do such a thing currently, there was no way that these information networks wouldn't take advantage of this. Of course, Lionel could use this to his advantage as well, and walk a tightrope of painting a false image of what he truly wanted while siphoning away information he actually needed. However, such a thing would only be possible if he already had a full understanding of the scope of many things. But if he had that, why would he need the information networks to begin with? And just like that, he was back to square one. After reaching such a dead end, many would feel despair, but Lionel grinned beside himself. This sort of challenge, how long had it been since he felt it? How could he possibly hold back his smile? Unfortunately, when the boys saw Lionel's eyes glaze over and a creepy smile spread across his face, they still thought he was thinking of the strip club. Alan shook his head, shifting his glasses up his nose. Cap has already fallen. I think we might need to replace she who shall not be named soon before he falls into depravity. Drake agreed. Drake, unlike the others, played the same position as Lionel, quarterback. It was just that he was a rookie when Lionel was a senior, and given how good Lionel was, he never got the chance to play. Still, he had spent most of his freshman year emulating everything Lionel did, because Lionel was his idol. So he had picked up many of Lionel's habits, including an overall disdain for all things women, until he could find his own Aina. By now, what once was an emulation had become the true Drake, so he too felt an obligation to save their captain. As for Alan, he was pretty much asexual. He didn't find any fondness in women or men, he just liked his computer screens and programming. Unfortunately, rather than gaining a programming profession, he had been slotted in as a 5-star safety, and was forced to play football from a young age. To make matters more depressing, the ability he awakened also had nothing to do with programming, leaving him even more depressed. It seemed the world didn't want him doing what he loved to do the most. All right. Lionel chuckled. Forget the strip club for now. In a bit, I plan on leaving for a legacy I've been putting off for a long time. It won't be right to do anything until I can leave the 3rd dimension and enter the 4th and hopefully 5th. Lionel knew that he would be able to blaze through the 4th dimension. Thanks to his metal body, his body was mostly tempered already. While it would take even most talents years, it should take him at most a few weeks to months. Theoretically, anyway. But in order to do this, he definitely needed the rest of dimensional cleanse first. You're leaving again already? Raj pouted. For such a big man, the face he made was almost adorable. Lionel smiled. This time I won't be away for long. In fact, I promise that every step we take forward from now on will be together. Hearing such a promise, the eyes of the group lit up. It seemed that Lionel realized he had been neglecting them too. Since that was the case, there was no need to say anything more. If there was anything they could trust in Lionel for, it was that he would never make the same mistake twice. For now, I think you guys are right. Trying to take down your organizations from the inside out will prove to be difficult. Rather than that, I only want you to monitor them and gather up information. Even things you all feel are useless, note them down and preferably memorize them. Since I'm here, though, I won't leave without giving you all something in return. Lionel scanned the room. He had left them all to grow and improve on their own for too long. If he wanted to be a king, his own combat prowess wasn't the only one of importance. He had to make sure that everyone around him would grow as well. And luckily, he had formulated a technique perfect for this based on the ability index. Dream Path. Chapter 841. Dream Path took inspiration from both the ability index and Aina's ability. Lionel had always found it fascinating that Aina was able to intuit the next step of her progression, and had wondered what it would feel like to have such an ability. Of course, Lionel was under no illusions that Dream Path would be anywhere near as good as Aina's own innate ability. At best, it could simulate maybe 1 or 2% of the effect. However, Lionel still felt that this was enough of a helping hand to push his teammates in the right direction. It was clear that they were growing well on their own. If one was purely looking at their dimensions, they had already left him far behind. But Lionel wanted to give them more focused growth. Joel, you fall into the Blade Affinity Ability Index, right? Joel nodded. In the beginning, he could only add a sharpened aura to his weapons. But now he had grown far beyond just that. The only difference between himself and Emna from Crimson Hall was that the latter specialized in short blades and daggers while he preferred polearm weapons like his pike, or a halberd or spear. At the moment, he still used the same D-grade pike he had earned from his very first zone. But this was still enough to leave him among the average in terms of weapons. He had mostly not changed it due to sentimental value. How far along are you in comprehending your universal cycles? I've comprehended winter and summer on my own. But I'm having trouble with the milder spring and fall. Lionel continued to ask Joel several questions before he fell into silence, closing his eyes. After several minutes, Lionel extended a finger forward, pressing it to Joel's forehead. In that moment, Joel experienced what felt like a dream, but it was as though he was lucid for every moment of it. Everything was so vivid that he almost began acting out every step of it. The dream didn't have any words or any expressed advice. It was more like a feeling. Joel felt like he was experiencing years of life and becoming wiser with every passing moment. By the end of it, he felt as though he could see a vague path forward. Lionel exhaled a long breath as he retracted his finger. If he wanted Joel and the others to comprehend everything on their own, he couldn't just give them comprehension. What he could do instead was give them a vague feeling of the path forward that made an unfamiliar path seem familiar to them. At the moment, Lionel was able to simulate about a year ahead for them. This would be able to streamline the process they would have made in a year into a fraction of the time. This was Dream Path. Lionel knew that he could likely simulate more time, but the more he pushed, the less accurate he would become, and more likely it would be for them to stray off course. This was the best outcome for his current level. Once he was finished with Joel, Lionel moved on to Milan. Milan, your energy shield ability index is almost at the reflection stage, correct? Milan nodded. Very close. But I doubt that if we went up a dimension that it would even be at the nullification stage. And your universal cycles? Milan scratched his head. I've never really thought about it. Isn't that just for weapons and elements? I wouldn't even know how to integrate it with my ability if it was possible to integrate with an ability at all. Lionel nodded, fell into silence, then pressed a finger onto Milan's forehead as well before moving on to Raj. Raj, your Earth Affinity Ability Index is a bit unique. It's difficult to rise it up to higher levels on your own. The Earth Affinity or any elemental affinity ability could be separated into multiple potential branching evolution paths. Some paths focused on volume of the element that could be moved, others focused on evolution of the element itself, say from red flames to blue flames, and still others focused on auxiliary abilities that could be produced. For example, Supreme Monet's Fire Affinity Ability Index evolved abilities that could heal her. This would fall into the third category. As for Raj, Lionel believed that his fell into the second category, the evolution of the element. This meant that Raj's strength wouldn't be in the volume of earth he could move, but rather in the quality of earth he could produce. Something like Elther's chaotic particle force would be at the highest end of what Raj could achieve. As for at the simplest end, it would be the normal earth beneath their feet. However, this is just an example. Lionel knew that Raj's evolution path was especially tied to carbon. If the third dimension was his peak, he would be aiming for something like diamond, graphene or bucky paper. In higher dimensions, there would be even more unique structures to form, and it would all rely on Raj's training and ingenuity. The unfortunate part was that Raj wasn't the sharpest tool in the box. Even until this point, he was still using normal Earth as though this was his limit. If one took an objective measurement of all 8 of them, Raj's ability definitely had the greatest potential, and was one of the few ability indexes that didn't have a simple 5-step journey to the top. But ironically, this difficulty for Raj made it the easiest for Lionel to guide. Unlike everyone else who Lionel had to be subtle with Raj, Lionel could just etch the step-by-step progression into his mind. Raj would never understand the nuances of the chemical structure. However, Lionel could make him understand the feel so that he could do it naturally. If there was anyone who could guide Raj in the subtleties of minerals and rocks, it was Lionel. Not only this, but Lionel could also simulate unique structures for Raj to create and make use of that might not even exist naturally in the world. It was almost a shame that this ability was born within Raj and not Lionel himself. Lionel was certain that by the time he returned, Raj would probably be the strongest of the 8 of them. I could do this. Why didn't anyone tell me? Raj smacked his own forehead with a meaty palm, causing Lionel to laugh beside himself. Wiping tears from his eyes, Lionel looked toward Alan. Alan, you've always wanted to become a programmer, right? How about I help you with that? Chapter 842. Alan's eyes glowed beneath his glasses as he stared at Lionel, with a little too much passion. One would have thought that he had every intention of jumping over the table like Gil almost did previously. Except this time, there didn't seem to be anyone prepared to stop him. Do you have something, Cap? Everyone is so stingy. I can't find information I want at any time like we could back on Earth. Even if we couldn't take it back home, at least we had everything at school. Alan's excitement turned down into a frown. Lionel's brothers had no idea what kind of background he had, especially since Lionel hardly understood as well. Lionel didn't see the Morales or Luxnix families as backers. He rather saw them as connections he would have to take control of in the future. With how this dimensional verse worked, he was under no illusion that these families would just accept him with open arms. Since even Lionel was in a limbo, his teammates were even more so. Though Lionel was more powerful than they were, and clearly more talented, there was nothing certain about his accumulation of resources. Back on Earth, as students of the third-ranked academy, they had more information at their fingertips than they could consume in an entire lifetime. Though there were restrictions about taking this information off campus, that could be fixed with a single late-night stay at the library. The only reason Lionel hadn't done this, and was thus ranked third in his class behind both Aina and, ironically, Alan, was because he had a schedule to keep in order to return to his paradise island. The dimensional verse was the exact opposite. Anyone with information always hoarded it, and even organizations placed them behind gates that required merits or contributions to access. There was even some information that no number of merits could ever get you without an equivalent amount of status. It was clear then why Alan would feel so stifled. The fields that could relate to programming or coding in the dimensional verse were amongst the most gate-kept. Things like force crafting or force pill crafting, or any number of branching fields, were especially protected by their owners. It was because of this that Kayla had been taken advantage of by Jack Biennala for so long. Lionel smiled at Alan's question. Rather than answering directly, he asked a question of his own. What is your ability? I have a magnetic ability. I can apply magnetic fields to any surface. It works best on inorganic materials, but I can do it on organic materials as well, like skin. But it functions best on my own skin. If I wanted to apply a field to someone else, it would require touch because usually my ability could be repelled by foreskin if I tried to apply it from a distance. Lionel's smile widened into a grin. You were first in our class, but you can't see how useful such an ability would be? Alan pushed up his glasses. You want me to use it for something other than just making battle more convenient? Alan's use of his ability was actually quite skilled and clever. He applied his magnetic fields to surfaces to increase his speed and attack power. He could also apply them in reverse to act as a defensive barrier that could slow and sometimes even stop attacks entirely. And in addition to that, he was working on an absolute death domain of sorts that could make use of his ability in a longer-range sense. It could be said that while Raj's ability had the potential to become the most powerful, Alan's intelligence and ingenuity in using his ability would likely put his above the former. Raj's thinking was simply too simple, and that couldn't be changed just because of a few tips. As far as Lionel was concerned, though with his guidance, they'd all become that powerful. You're practically a living, breathing battery. Magnetic fields can be used to form anything from electricity all the way up to nuclear fusion. Alan raised an eyebrow. I know this, but Earth's technology is useless in the dimensional verse. What would be the point in using it that way? Well, it's only as useless as you allow it to be. If you didn't have such an ability, I would probably tell you to give up. But the fact you do makes it a different story entirely. You know what I noticed on my trip here? Lionel smiled mysteriously. Even fifth-dimensional stars undergo nuclear fusion. The energies they produce are different, and the process might have a few differences here and there, but the core of the process doesn't change. Alan's eyes suddenly lit up. You mean, as your ability grows, I have a feeling that the magnetism will continue to have similar affects to what it once had on third-dimensional Earth. You just might have a shortcut to bringing Earth's technology to the higher dimensions. Don't get too excited. Lionel laughed. I have a feeling that you won't really be the first. I doubt that there's a complete absence of technology at the very top. And if there is, that only means that it would be even more difficult than we think to accomplish it. But we have an advantage. There should be very few if any worlds that reached our level of technology before entering the fourth dimension. Our third dimension technology was even capable of harming fourth dimensional existences. Second, we come from a very talented world. The most talented if the information I have is correct. That means if there's anyone who can do it, it would be us. And finally, even if we fail to form the technology itself, if you can become what essentially amounts to a sentient star reactor. Lionel didn't finish his words, but Gil already began to complain. Damn, who gave Four Eyes such an OP ability? Lionel laughed and pointed a finger to Alan's forehead before he focused his attention on Gil. He might as well do him next. Chapter 843. Gil's ability was related to the lightning element. But rather than falling into the second category like Raj, his own fell into the third category like Supreme Monet's. Instead of gaining access to volume, power or an evolution, he gained access to special abilities as his lightning progressed. From what Lionel could tell, these abilities were all related to speed, making Gil a speedster, albeit not a pure speedster, but one that relied on the elements. Still, after some inspection, Lionel realized that Gil's ability was more subtle than that, and worked especially well on the nervous system. The good news was that it didn't just work well on his nervous system, but that of others as well. Having come to this conclusion, it was easier for Lionel to map out Gil's next steps with Dream Path. He would focus not only on his speed, but also preventive measures in battle. He would be very effective at area control alongside Raj and Milan. Following this, Lionel moved on to Arnold. After a while of observation, he couldn't help but be intrigued. Explain your ability to me, Arnold. Arnold held up his large hands. The simple action caused the rippling muscles and veins along his arms to flex and pop. One would have thought just from this sight that he had a strength-based ability, but this was far from the truth. I'm not sure what to call it, Arnold started in his gravelly voice, but my palm shoots out energy that has strong vibrations. Lionel couldn't help but smile at Arnold's simple and direct answer. One would have thought that his deep, raspy voice hurt his throat to use because this was about as many words as he would say in a single sitting. Do it, Lionel said. Arnold blinked but didn't think much of it as he shot a palm toward Lionel. Lionel's pale violet eyes glowed as he matched it with his own palm. Bang! The table beneath their blow splintered and shattered. No. Raj dove after the food, displaying a nimbleness his large body had no business having. Lionel's eyes widened. The sleeve of the tracksuit he had swapped into was torn to shreds, revealing the toned arms beneath. Unable to hold it in, the chair beneath him shattered, sending him tumbling backward. Even after Lionel's hand separated from Arnold's, he could still feel it trembling on an almost cellular level. If it wasn't for his metal body, his arm might have already burst at the seams, but he could tell that Arnold had most definitely held back. Wow! Lionel felt that Arnold's ability fell into a unique category. Every so often, an ability without an ability index would appear. Sale's Oddflower pupil ability was among these. There was no strict ability index for her, and she could only gradually strengthen her ability and find out its particular quirks on her own. At first glance, Arnold's ability seemed similar to Big Buddha, who had been killed by Lionel in the Camelot Zone. This ability would fall into the Palm Affinity Ability Index and be categorized by power, size and the quality of force it produced. However, there were many problems with this categorization. Firstly, Big Buddha's hand physically expanded, but Arnold's did not. And second and most importantly, this unique force that Arnold produced was on a level all to its own. It was one thing to induce vibrations, but to do it on a cellular level was a different beast entirely. What if Arnold's ability increased to the point he could do it on a molecular level? What about an atomic level? What about an even deeper level than that? Of course, it had to be considered that Lionel's body was only at the fourth dimension, so Arnold might not have such an affect when facing someone at the fifth or higher dimension. But the potential was striking nonetheless. Fascinating. Lionel's eyes glowed. And your universal cycles? I mastered them all, Arnold replied simply. The group of brothers all looked toward Arnold as though he was some sort of monster. Even the best among them, Joel, had only mastered 2. When was he planning to tell them that he had already grasped all of them on his own? Lionel began to laugh beside himself. This was just like Arnold. He didn't present information that wasn't asked for. And even then, it would depend on how much he liked you. If you weren't a friend of his, he wouldn't even bother to answer a question that had been asked. This was probably why Arnold wasn't among the seated geniuses. His organization probably had no idea how powerful he was. And have you touched the heavenly body realm? Beyond the Four Seasons realm was the heavenly body realm. Knowing Arnold, even if he did succeed, he wouldn't say a word. So Lionel decided to purposely ask. Arnold wasn't the smartest in the room. However, there was something about his straightforward and stoic personality that made him an absolute beast when it came to comprehending such arts. He knew what he wanted and he never overthought things. This was a deadly combination when it came to reaching realms that often relied on feel. So when Arnold gave his answer, Lionel wasn't surprised in the least. I have a small grasp of the meteor. Lionel exhaled a light breath along with everyone else. While the Four Seasons realm was split into concepts of summer, winter, spring and fall, the heavenly body realm conceptualized 4 levels of heavenly body: the meteor, the moon, the planet and the stars. To be within the 4th dimension and grasp the meteor through self-comprehension placed Arnold among the best in the dimensional verse in terms of universe cycle comprehension. One more thing, Arnold, Lionel continued with his eyes narrowing slightly. Did you comprehend to supplement your palms or your body? This was maybe the most important question Lionel could ask. To have comprehended it just for his palms would be impressive enough. But if he was like Lionel and could apply universal force freely, it was a different matter entirely. Chapter 844. Arnold blinked, showing the first hints of an expression: confusion. He wasn't sure what Lionel meant by that. But this only made sense. Even Lionel hadn't known about this. It could be said that he had randomly stumbled upon it out of luck. That day when he first learned about universal cycles and exited the Camelot zone to speak to Uncle Montez, he had offhandedly said something about applying universe force to everything from his spear to his bow to his movement techniques. He hadn't realized it then, but he had already planted a seed for what was to come. After stepping into the dimensional verse in earnest, though Lionel had come to learn that his thinking was radical. In this part of the dimensional verse, at least, no one spoke of universal cycles outside of their use with elements and weapons. Due to this, Arnold's scope of comprehension had been unwittingly cut off by the ignorance of those around him, limiting his growth. If he grew too far, it might have even become impossible to reverse at all. In that case, Lionel knew exactly how Arnold should progress. Lionel brought out a new table from the segmented cube and helped Raj order more food before he cried too many tears. Then he pressed a finger to Arnold's forehead. Arnold's expression changed numerous times in the span of just a few seconds. He had never known that universal cycles could be comprehended in this way. If it was possible, the boost to his strength wouldn't be small. But, if he wanted to do this, he would have to give up his conception of the meteor in order to take a step back and rebuild his Four Seasons conceptions. At the same time, though Lionel learned something from Arnold as well, Lionel had never really been trying to progress from the Four Seasons realm toward the heavenly body realm. That said, he had always subconsciously believed that something was missing. What he hadn't known, though, was that what was missing was so blatantly in his face. Whenever others used universal force, their conceptualizations would cause phenomena to appear in the form of the blazing heat of summer or the blistering cold of winter, as 2 examples. But whenever Lionel used his own, nothing happened. Lionel had previously thought that this was because he had transcended the need to do this, but now that he thought about it, that made no sense. If the true form of the Four Seasons realm had nothing to do with the Four Seasons, then why did it even have such a name to begin with? It would be one thing if it was only known as such in this corner of the universe, but even his father's dictionary called it the Four Seasons realm, and Uncle Montez did as well. Obviously, he was missing something important. Feeling the subtle use of universal force Arnold had, and even how powerful his conceptualizations were, left Lionel in awe. He realized then that his universal force use might have been more powerful than others, but it was ultimately still just a shell. He was at the very beginning of a realm with endless depths, and he hadn't even bothered to take a single step forward. How foolish. That fear of missing out on something important Lionel had formed 2 years ago suddenly came back in full force. He realized that he needed to be more diligent and conscientious. He couldn't allow such big holes in his comprehension to continue on for so long. Once Lionel removed his finger from Arnold's forehead, the latter suddenly smiled. Huh. Am I seeing things? Milan rubbed his head. This blockhead knows how to smile. Arnold swept a gaze over toward Milan, clearly filled with silent disdain. You want to go meet for hands? Arnold once again didn't respond, ignoring Milan completely. It seems that it was inaccurate to say that Milan and Arnold had a rivalry similar to Franco and Gil. Milan had been losing for years, and it seemed he would never turn it around. What kind of rivalry was that? Lionel chuckled and looked toward the final two, Drake and Franco. Drake had a top-tier marksmanship ability. Unlike Double Shot, his own came with a homing ability. The marksmanship ability index was split into multiple categories. Drake, though, seemed to gain the abilities from two, making him what was called a pure marksman. The categories were as follows for a pure marksman: Sharp, Lock, Curve, Homing, and Marksman. Sharp gave one a heightened sensitivity to the environment and how it might affect a shot. Lock allowed one to tag an enemy with stronger senses than what one would have in Sharp, giving one at this level a small predictive ability along with the prowess to not lose sight of an enemy within a certain range. Curve branched the senses of a marksman toward more telekinetic abilities. The difference here is that it relies on communication between the sensory lock and the marksman. The deviation allowed was very small compared to the next level. Homing allows for far more freedom, and a projectile from a marksman at this level can even follow an enemy through a weaving path for an extended period of time without losing power. Finally, there was Marksman. Unlike most ability indexes, this was not reserved for savants, though its highest levels were. Marksman allowed near-omniscient predictive abilities about what an enemy would do next and how they would react. It was eerily similar to Lionel's own dream simulation ability. At the highest level, reserved for savants, they could practically see into the future. At the lowest, it was possible to see a few branching paths and their probabilities. The main difference between Lionel and someone at this level was that the latter would be completely reliant on their eyes. This would not extend to their soul force. At the moment, Drake was doing quite well and had stepped into the lowest levels of homing within the fifth dimension. This was excellent for a fourth-dimensional existence, and Lionel had high hopes for him. Chapter 845. Finally, there was Franco. He looked toward Lionel with anticipation, hoping that his outcome would be as great as everyone else's. His ability was quite simple. It was a pure physical boost. However, it wasn't as simple as the most common increases to strength, speed, or the like. Rather, it was a holistic upgrade in everything from his senses to his speed to his reaction time. Franco would probably benefit the most from comprehending all-encompassing universal force, but Lionel understood that such a thing couldn't be expected. There would be very few people like him and Arnold. He had to be careful with setting the bar too high, or else Franco would be the one to suffer most should he fail. Rather than doing this, Lionel tailored Franco's future path to what he loved. Franco seemed to think that the broadsword was the coolest weapon that there was, so Lionel allowed him to continue along that path. At the same time, he incorporated a mandatory daily routine for flexibility. Cap, you don't really want me to do this, right? Lionel grinned. What's the matter? I would rather die. Oh, come on, it's just a little stretching. A little stretching in preparation for what? Franco was almost speechless. I don't swing that way even for you, Cap. Lionel's lip twitched. He was just trying to help. How did this become a question of his sexuality? Franco really had an overactive imagination. Stop complaining so much. If you want to maximize your ability, your limbs need to be limber. If they aren't, you'll only be impeding yourself. Also, be sure to only perform the stretches after weight training. If you do it before, you'll affect your performance and increase chances of injury. If you do it after, you'll be able to loosen up tightened muscles and promote more healthy growth. Agate. Why couldn't I get a cool routine like everyone else? What did Cap ask you to do? Milan asked curiously. Fuck you. I'm taking this to the grave. Light laughter filled the table as the 9 of them talked and chatted. Finally, Lionel felt that it was about time he left. I'm going to give each of you 2 treasures that suit you. But, you have to remember to only use the more valuable of the 2 if you're in a life or death situation. Don't go around showing off unless you all want to be buried before your time. I'm not entirely sure how long you'll be gone, but I don't think it will take much time. The person who gave me the map didn't specify too much, so I assume that since I can read it, I'm strong enough. Lionel casually explained some things before he began to craft. It was clear he had no idea the level of commotion he was about to cause, nor the kind of sparks he was about to light ablaze. Days later, Lionel found himself on the same small ship he had left behind on a deserted planet. He sat in silence for a long while, seemingly organizing his thoughts. His heartbeat was steady, his blood flowed smoothly, and his breathing had a calming cadence to it. The items that Aina had left behind sat on his lap without making a single sound. He had already checked, but there was no final message, no apology, and not even an enraged rant about how terrible of a boyfriend he was. Even if one pried Lionel open to the point of being able to read his mind, one would never guess that he was going through a breakup. Maybe even Lionel's own dream simulation wouldn't be able to pick up on this at all. I wonder how long Dad has been away from Mom. At least 18 years, right? Did they talk in that time? Did they miss each other? Why did they separate at all? Was there a good reason? Or was the reason as terrible as this one? Lionel wondered. His dad had left him without even a word of goodbye. Well, if his holographic messages were excluded, anyway, could that be because he was so excited to reunite with his wife? Or was there another reason? Now that Lionel thought about it, he wasn't even certain that his parents were still together. For all he knew, they were divorced. It would be nice if you were here, old man. You really know how to disappear at the worst of times. Lionel didn't even bother to try and speak to the dictionary. Although it had his father's voice, it sounded too synthetic. It would piss him off more than it would help him. Before him sat a split path between duty and love. Somehow, Lionel almost knew that this same split road was what had separated his parents for so long. It was a cruel choice indeed. Lionel leaned his back into his chair and closed his eyes. Deep, rhythmic breathing filled the quiet ship. Like this, a lone young man sat upon a desolate planet, being the only living soul within dozens of light years. Within the depths of space, a small ship tore through the fabric of reality. It rattled and shook, but eventually pierced its way through. And what it saw on the other side was nothing short of maybe the most spectacular scene the 3 women on board have ever witnessed. There wasn't just a single planet ahead. Rather, there were 3. They slowly rotated around one another, as though they were each other's moons while simultaneously having numerous smaller true moons hovering around them. One planet was covered in deep violet oceans and had light lavender clouds to match. Its continents were endless expanses of silver that twinkled even in the night. The second planet looked like a golden marble matched with swirls of the whitest white. The clouds formed gorgeous patterns across its body, making it look like a delicately sculpted pastry or a beautiful piece of abstract art. The last planet was covered in mountains so tall that they protruded like horns out from its surface, through its clouds and past even its atmosphere. These monumentous mountains stood proudly as the lush blue oceans and delicate white clouds circled its feet. Each one of these planets had a unique character to it that could shake one to their core. And this was the first sight these 3 women saw the moment they stepped into the 6th dimension. Aina gazed out of the window, her red eyes having receded and her expression having become more neutral. How long had it been? How long had it been since she saw her father? Chapter 846. Lionel opened his eyes once more, a pool of calmness resting within their pale violet depths. Funny enough, what he most struggled with wasn't the emotions themselves, but rather the decision to abandon them or not. With the balance having been even, the choice was left to him. The logical decision was to leave things as status quo. After all, A tie was usually dealt with in that fashion. But such a decision also meant that he would have to carry this around, and he almost didn't want to. It was impeding his thought process too much, taking up too much of his time. In the end, Lionel was forced to compartmentalize his distracting thoughts. However, somehow, one mind didn't seem enough to do that. He was forced to assign over 100 before they were satisfied, and that left him at a 10% deficit he wouldn't normally have. Still, Lionel paid the price. Anything so that his mind would be clear and free. If he hadn't done this, the impact to his cognitive function would have been even worse. At least now he could split his mind more than 1,000 ways. Since he had gotten by with just a few dozen in the past, if he couldn't wreak havoc with over 900, then he might as well give up all his goals right this moment. With that done, Lionel took out the piece of polished memory organ. It had been with him for years already, but this was only the second time he had it in his hands like this. It had a gentle oval shape to it, and it was such a shimmering silver that Lionel could see even his own reflection with astounding clarity. And yet it felt rough to the touch. Lionel was certain that the memory or hadn't felt like this when he first got it. But now something had changed. After eliminating several possibilities, Lionel realized that it must be that his own sensitivities had evolved. Not only did Lionel's Tier 9 metal body make him far more sensitive to ores and their refined metals, but the habit Lionel had built in splitting his minds to increase his sensory perception was also coming into play as well. Lionel realized at the moment that his internal sight wouldn't be enough to read this map. Even though he had entered the fifth dimension with his dream force, it was being weighed down by his true dimension. He would have to rely on a combination of his variant Earth affinity and his internal sight to accomplish his goal. After observing the memory or for a moment longer, Lionel focused and began to read it. According to Uncle Montez, this memory or was a map. But Lionel knew that memory or was capable of housing so much information that the computer chips of even 25th century Earth would run out of space before even a dent could be put into it. And that was all the computer chips to ever exist and would ever exist. The difference was that exaggerated. Lionel found it hard to believe that a map would need so much space. And if it did, how could he ever read it? A memory or would be capable of housing a map of the entire universe. But if this was really what was in here, Lionel might as well give up and choose a different technique to enter the fourth dimension with. How would he even begin to orient himself on such a large map? Lionel could only hope that while the memory or had such great capacity, only a fraction of it was being used. Maybe it was just a habit of large families and organizations to waste memory or like this? Even on Earth, the rich like using precious metals in places they had no business being, like toilets. What Lionel actually found, though, left him stunned. This isn't a map. There's not even any information in here. What is this? A clue? An encryption? The image Lionel was seeing was blurry at first. One had to remember how difficult it was to use memory ores. It required an incredibly subtle use of soul force to disrupt its chemical structure. This disruption could then be decoded as a message by the next individual. The issue with this, though, was that reading a memory or was like wading through a minefield. If you were too forceful or not careful enough, you could disrupt the chemical structure, and thus destroy the information you were trying to read. Of course, Lionel's own dream force was still too weak to inspire grand changes in such a high level, which was ironically why it was still possible for him to do this with little experience. However, even if he caused a small shift in a map that was meant to point to a position in the vastness of this universe, he could very well end up tens of thousands of light years off course. So Lionel was careful. Even with how confident he was in his dream force control, he was even more careful than he had to be. He was taking no chances. The result was that by the time he could see the first layer of information, he was stonewalled by the fact it wasn't information at all. Or, it wasn't exactly information just yet. More accurately, information could be stored in the memory or at several levels. The deepest and most difficult level to read was at the near-atomic level. The easiest, though, was stored in about the size of a cell on the human, which contained about 100 trillion atoms. So the disparity was clear. The good news was that this encryption was on the cell level, so Lionel, who had been working with things that size since he began practicing dimensional cleanse, to begin with, could see it clearly. The bad news, though, was that was where the familiarity and ease came to a grinding halt. Still, a smile curled Lionel's lip. Chapter 847. Encryptions? Puzzles? Codified games? This was what he was best at. Lionel ignored the first layer of encryptions and sunk deeper. The first layer was on a scale of 100 trillion atoms. The second was on a scale of 10 trillion. The third was on a scale of 1 trillion, and was the final layer. The interesting thing about the memory, was that it had no blockades toward looking toward a deeper level. However, the deeper one delved, the more convoluted and difficult it would be to pick out the layers, almost as though one was trying to untangle a pair of earphone cords with a single pull. However, for Lionel, it felt like he was staring down this tangled mess of cords, his eyes flashing as he followed the snaking path of one wire at a time. I see. So if I had just stepped in and completed the first encryption layer, I would have ruined the rest of it. At best, I would end up completely off course and never find the later portions of Dimensional Cleanse. At worst, I would end up in some black hole somewhere and never be seen or heard from again. Lionel chuckled at his own dark humor. If there was one thing he loved to do, it was win. But he was also a softy at heart, and often took a back seat so he wouldn't hurt the feelings of others. This led to an odd imbalance where sometimes he would go all out, and sometimes he would seem as though he was just taking a leisurely stroll, and couldn't be bothered with the outcome. But single-player games like this one were different. There was no one to hurt the feelings of here. It was him versus a puzzle some old man had probably had a lot of fun putting together. So for a moment, he forgot about all his worries. Lionel had almost made the very same mistake he had just warned himself against. The moment he had seen the first encryption, he had already thought of a solution. And it was probably the easiest solution available. But his instincts told him that things probably shouldn't be so easy. As intelligent as Lionel was, he was also aware of what was considered difficult for others and what was not. This perspective was incredibly important, especially if he wanted to be a king. He couldn't just simply assign people impossible tasks because he thought they were easy enough to complete. Luckily, Lionel had good EQ and an objective, almost too systematic, view of the world to pair with it. That first solution was something everyone but Raj would be able to think of within the first 10 minutes of seeing it. And even Raj might be able to fumble his way through in about 5 more minutes as long as he didn't give up. Simply put, the solution was too easy. So Lionel grew suspicious and looked deeper. As expected, it was a layered puzzle. Shifts in the first layer impacts the next and subsequent layers. But this made perfect sense. The memory was a whole and solid piece. It had a chemical structure that was entirely interdependent. Of course, a change at the beginning would impact the rest. The irony of it all was that if Lionel went with the first solution, the second layer would untangle in a way that made it even easier to solve. And should he go with the first solution he thought of for the second layer, the third layer would follow the same pattern. But if Lionel then followed suit and completed the first solution for the third layer, the second layer would deform into a more complex form. And if he solved the second layer again, the same would happen to the first. It would result in a cycle of ever-increasing complexity, without end. The good news about accidentally following this path was that, as far as Lionel could tell, it was possible to undo it by backtracking. But the bad news was that backtracking couldn't be done by simply doing the reverse of what you had done. Lionel placed down the memory on his lap and entered his dream world. With a thought, a replica of the first 3 layers formed. The first thing he did was begin to count the number of solutions for the first layer. But after he got to 10,000, his lip couldn't help but continuously twitch. Not only did each subsequent solution become harder to find, but Lionel had a feeling that there truly were an infinite number. If he tried to count them out and choose the best, he would be here for a lifetime. What a clever puzzle. The 3 layers floated in space almost like a chemical model made of sticks and balls. Every shift, even if it was just in one, interrupted everything else, making the task especially daunting. At that moment, Lionel's eyes glowed. Every shift interrupts everything else. In that case, why bother starting with the first layer? No, more accurately, there's no obligation to start there. If Lionel looked at each layer individually, they all seemed to have countless solutions. For every solution he thought of for the first layer, he would proceed to the second layer to count its solutions, and then do the same for the third. The result was what felt like an overload of information. If not for Dream Sculpt to keep track of everything, Lionel would have long since been overwhelmed. However, what would happen if he ignored the first layer and started with the others instead? Interesting. The second layer still has hundreds of solutions, but it's far less than the tens of thousands I already found for the first layer. And better yet, there is a hard cap. If I ignore the first two layers and start with the third, there are just a few dozen solutions. And once again, there's a hard cap. Lionel's eyes glowed, calculations spinning about in his mind at an ungodly speed. There it is. The real solution. Lionel's eyes flashed open, his dream force surging into the memory Oregon. Chapter 848. The moment things clicked into place, Lionel felt that the rough surface of the memory, or had suddenly become smooth once again. He smiled lightly, knowing that he had come to the right conclusion. Now that Lionel thought about it, he probably could have asked the dictionary to do it all for him. On a distant world, Uncle Montez was definitely choking on his drink. The test of the memory, or was meant to be completed individually. The dictionary was definitely something the person who created it wouldn't have taken into account, and it would have been nothing short of cheating to make use of it. Either way, the dictionary might have been able to direct a solution, but the deft control of Dreamforce it took to implement it was a different story entirely. There was nothing that it could do about that. Lionel's mind delved into the memory or once again. This time, however, it felt as though he was witnessing the birth of a gorgeous and clear picture. Compared to the jumbled mess there was before, it felt like Lionel was going from reading the scribbles of a toddler to the masterworks of a world-renowned writer. Lionel had always thought that a memory or had to be read, but now he knew it was something you experienced and felt. The best way he would describe it was like ringing and tuning a fork. Depending on the size and material, a resonance of sound would be produced. A memory or was like this, but for the mind's eye. The memory or resonated like it had been wrung under the influence of Lionel's dream force. The result was a vivid picture being painted in his mind. Lionel realized then that it would always be obvious when he had come to the right conclusion. Only this conclusion could make the memory or sing like this. Suddenly, Lionel didn't just have a location in mind, but he could feel it. What was most astonishing, though, was that he didn't get the chance to go toward that location. He couldn't even react before the sparse force around him began to resonate along with the memory Oregon. Lionel's eyes hardly had time to widen before all the force on the small, desolate planet he was on whooshed toward him. A massive dust storm of red-brown sand, dirt and rock was formed. From above, it looked as though the small planet was forming an eye of its own all around a tiny spaceship barely 2 meters in length. Then, it all vanished. When the dust storm cleared, there was nothing but a small crater left. As for Lionel, he was nowhere to be seen. Within the depths of the sixth dimension, a small silver ship hung in the skies. Unlike what one would find in the fifth or fourth dimensions, space travel within the sixth was as common as driving a car was back on 21st century Earth. All around, there were ships of all shapes and sizes, following lanes controlled by magical beams of light. These lanes of light seemed to manifest from nothing and curved in controlled paths as though they had minds of their own. If one observed closely, they even seemed to follow orbital-like patterns of their own, slowly and subtly shifting through the deep skies as they weaved in and out of each other. Yet, as opposed to the chaos one might expect from such a thing, it had a maddening sort of order to it that everyone involved seemed completely used to. Some spaceships shot into the distance, leaving the orbit of the 3 planets. Others carefully changed lanes to reach their desired planet. And still others, like the small ship manned by Yuri, took their time to circle around the sparser regions to enter their desired path. After a moment, Yuri managed to find a lane toward the planet Violet Planet with silver lands, following along the congestion. Despite the traffic, she was finally able to relax and allow things to go on autopilot. As in control as she had pretended to be this whole time. This was the first time she had manned a ship to cross folds of reality. Doing such a thing was incredibly dangerous and many died doing so. This was why no one casually shifted between dimensions if it could be helped. If one was going to do so, the easiest way would be to use a top-quality talisman. At least this way, the process would be smooth. Unfortunately, Yuri hadn't had one. Yuri her chair back to look toward Aina and Savon. She nodded to herself when she noticed that Aina was at least more put together now. The only shame was that Aina's gaze had returned to the same coldness it had when she exited her very first zone. The very eyes she had had when she killed Conrad. If Yuri had to pick a moment, that was the one where her determination was the highest. Right then, it seemed that Aina was consumed with thoughts of revenge. This planet is controlled by the Viola family and shares their namesake. They are a powerful sixth-dimensional family. To be honest, I don't know how adoptive father is related to them, so I can only say that we should be careful. Savon nodded as she stretched her limbs and fingers out one by one. She was still trying to get used to the sixth dimension. It wasn't as exaggerated as Yuri made it out to be. At least she didn't feel as weak as a mortal, but it was definitely far heavier than a fifth-dimensional world. It felt like the gravity was 3 or 4 times the norm despite the fact they weren't even on a planet yet. Aina! Yuri called out. You can't walk around with that pretty face out like this. The sixth dimension is dangerous enough without having to deal with horny men all the time. Wear this. Yuri took a mask out of her spatial ring and tossed it over. Aina was speechless, but she could only shake her head at Yuri's teasing. Still, she put the black mask on. But at least Yuri also took out 2 more for herself and Savon as well. At that moment, the silver ship broke through the atmosphere of the planet. Down below, a certain man was already waiting. Chapter 849. A ship docking station wasn't a simple operation. From the inside, it looked more like a honeycomb with several hexagonal compartments. From the outside, it looked like a massive glass dome one could watch the chaos from a distance thanks to. The honeycomb-like parking stations came in various shapes and sizes depending on, obviously, the size of the ship that needed them. Some were permanent and bought out by frequent travelers, merchants or various other companies. But most were temporary stations that were rented out based on need. If one was from a family with a decent background, it was more likely than not that someone would park their ship within their own estate. However, only those of a superior noble standing were allowed to do this. With so much traffic coming in and out, how could a world like this not have its own laws? These glass domes that were dotted around the planet at various popular locations weren't just for show. One couldn't just land your ship wherever you pleased. If one wanted to travel around the planet, there were very specific and very few lanes you could take with a spaceship. Should you want more freedom, you would need different permits and also a different kind of vessel to take you as well. Only the very rich and influential could have exclusive lanes of their own that allowed for more private and less regulated travel. Unsurprisingly, Yuri allowed the ship's autopilot to follow along with everyone else and toward one of the many honeycomb parking stations. This was the number and location her adoptive father had told her to go toward. And as expected, before the ship even docked, the 3 women caught sight of the man. Aina's heart stopped beating for a moment, her eyes reddening beneath her mask. Even though she thought she had squeezed all the tears her body had left out, seeing her father for the first time in such a long time placed her on the verge of breaking down once again. Even within the hustle and bustle of the docking station, this man seemed to have carved out a piece of space all to his own. The hem of his robes were unaffected by the whipping winds, and ships subconsciously took the long way around him. He had a head of fiery red hair with such volume that it almost looked like the mane of a lion. It was only accented all the more by his full face of crimson facial hair. He had a back as broad as a bear's and a chest as wide as a gorilla's. He stood at over 7 feet tall, and yet it didn't seem out of place or awkward. He filled out his frame with power and strength that made the wind around him slow by several measures. His pair of ruby-red eyes almost seemed lazy, but given the rest of his appearance, it was like he was giving the world a chance to breathe. If even they had been sharp, maybe the whole of the docking station would have been frozen in place, unable to go about their day with any sort of ease. However, what Aina saw wasn't the scary sort of projection, or a stifling, grueling portrayal of what a man could be. She just saw her father. She leapt out from the spaceship before it could even settle down. When Lionel's vision cleared, he found himself still in his small ship, but the surroundings felt completely different. What were memory ores meant to be capable of teleporting individuals? From Lionel's understanding, the answer to that question was no. But if he thought about it a step further than this, maybe the resonance of the memory, or when it entered that perfect state, was quite resounding. What was a force art if not resonance of energy? Force arts used various languages written with force in order to induce specific and practiced reactions in the world at large. Who was to say that a force art cleverly hidden within a memory, or couldn't produce the same effect? In fact, in order to draw more permanent force arts like Lionel did when he created treasures, didn't he have to use precious ores and materials? What was a memory or if not a precious material? In fact, using it to draw in force to accomplish this feat may very well have been overkill. May have been anyway. Lionel wasn't certain if it was because he had no idea where he was. What he did know, though, was that this was the heaviest pressure he had ever experienced. Even when Lionel entered a fifth-dimensional world as a third-dimensional existence, it had felt no different from a spring breeze. But the moment his body became aware that it had reappeared in wherever this place was, he had actually had trouble breathing for a moment. Unlike other ships, Lionel's didn't have windows. He had built it with speed, escape and defense in mind, so how could he leave such an obvious weakness? He had instead used his internal sight and the dictionary to make up for this deficiency. But at the moment, that choice left him blind for the first few seconds he had spent in this mysterious place. Taking a deep breath, Lionel steeled himself. He couldn't just stay in here forever, right? Somewhere deep inside, he felt like he needed to see what was out there with his own two eyes. His instinct told him that this was a feeling that had to be experienced in the rawest of forms. The hatch slowly opened, the compressed air sizzling out in a low, drawn-out steam. Lionel couldn't help but take a breath when he saw what was before him. It was a road. However, this road was formed of sparkling, white motes of light and extended toward what felt like infinity. It was about 10 meters in width and was surrounded by nothing but endless darkness. Lionel didn't need to be a genius to know that if he took one step off, his life would be forfeit. In the far-off distance, a blue star hovered in silence. It was maybe the most gorgeous blue Lionel had ever seen. A wide expanse of skies or a cool, transparent ocean didn't seem capable of measuring up. Maybe only a delicately sculpted and polished sapphire gem could even begin to compare. The star was caged by an enormous Dyson sphere Lionel assumed his road of light connected to. It was the sort of picture Lionel could have never thought he would ever see just 5 years ago. And with it came a spine-tingling alert of danger Lionel had never experienced before. Chapter 850. Lionel took a cautious step outward, his hair standing on end. However, no matter how he swept his gaze or his internal sight, he couldn't catch a wisp of anything. As far as he could tell, there really was nothing but a single expansive road headed toward that beautiful blue star surrounded by a cage of rotating silver. The Dyson sphere was something Lionel had only read about in science fiction novels. Even 25th century Earth had never been able to accomplish such a thing. According to a scientist by the name of Kardashev, civilizations could be separated in strength by their energy resources. At the lowest Type 1 level, a civilization could be capable of making perfect usage of nuclear fusion, the energy of the stars. By this logic, Earth of the 21st century was not yet Type 1 as it could only use the much less efficient nuclear fission. Beyond the Type 1 level was the much grander Type 2, and that was where the Dyson sphere came into play. Such a civilization would be able to harness the energy of their star, or stars with the use of the cage Lionel was seeing right this very moment. A Dyson sphere was a spherical cage that could wrap around an entire star to gather its energy. This particular Dyson sphere was constructed of numerous silver rings spinning about one another like the rings of a planet. It was a truly fantastical scene. Of course, as a young man born in the 25th century, old enough to witness the metamorphosis, Lionel now knew that while Kardashev's ideas were quite good, they were ultimately wrong because he had no way of knowing about the evolution of dimensions. Earth never got the chance to progress beyond Type 1. And at the same time, Type 3 civilizations beyond Type 2 might not be necessary considering the ever-increasing strength of stars as they progress through the dimensions. This was all to say that a world capable of harnessing a fourth-dimensional star's power would likely be more powerful than even the Type 4, V, or beyond civilizations that Earth had posited. This painted a perfect picture for why Lionel was so stunned. After all, he was seeing something that he had only ever witnessed in fictional novels and movies right in front of him. But none of this explained why his hair was standing on end, or why his foot had stopped halfway down from stepping out of his space shuttle. Lionel took deep breaths. Rather than pushing himself forward, he pulled his foot back. He had a feeling that the moment he stepped down, an event would begin that he would have no chance of stopping until he walked to the very end. In the past 2 years, Lionel had managed to master every quasi-bronze and below spear within spear domain. It could be said that his comprehension of the spear had reached a godly level amongst those at the 4th dimension, and even experts at the 5th. The only shame was that his ability had also grown so powerful that when he fought, he rarely if ever had to lean on this skill at all. The reason Lionel was remembering back to this now was because during that time, the number of primitive consciousnesses that he had absorbed were almost too numerous to count. With that, the instinct Lionel had fostered within himself likewise grew to a point where it almost became a second ability of his. Lionel felt that there was a reason the spear domain was constructed like this. It was built on a philosophy that skill, senses and power weren't enough to make a true master of a weapon. What one needed to complete the cycle was an ingrained reaction, an experienced instinct to react to even situations one had never seen before. It could be said that Lionel's own philosophy clashed with this. The same way he had chosen the spear out of convenience rather than love like Old Man Hutch had. He didn't like the idea of relying on something so vague. But, at the same time, he was logical enough to understand just how many times this instinct had helped him to this point. That could not be denied. Lionel closed his eyes and adjusted himself. When he opened them once more, he began to move. He didn't know why, but amidst a sudden wave of nostalgia, he pulled out the same pair of sweatpants and long-sleeve compression shirt he had worn when he entered his very first zone. Compared to back then when it stank to high heaven, it had a faint touch of a lavender scent to it that made it clear that it had been cleaned. Lionel slipped the gray sweats on and rolled the tight compression shirt over his toned torso. Bending down, he tightened a pair of worn sneakers, his heart feeling lighter and lighter with his every action. Finally, Lionel slipped on a simple chain necklace that seemed formed of stainless steel. This was a third treasure he had formulated for his teammates, and would be the only defensive treasure he wore. But this just felt like enough. Standing upright within his open shuttle, Lionel stretched his limbs. Yip. Yip. Lionel smiled. Seemingly having sensed the danger, Little Blackstar had come out of the segmented cube. The little guy had been obsessed with ordering Candle and Vice around recently. I'm going to have to do this one alone, buddy. Don't worry, I'll be back soon. Little Blackstar blinked, staring into Lionel's eyes. It took a while, but the little guy soon disappeared as well. With that, Lionel's gaze steeled, his ship and the bits and pieces of Earth that had been swept up along with it vanishing as his feet made contact with the road of light. At that same moment, a monstrous double-sided spear appeared in Lionel's hands, his body limber and ready. It didn't take even a moment for the road to suddenly begin to tremble, a shimmering figure beginning to manifest. What Lionel didn't know, though, was that all around, facing the brilliant star from directions so far from him, he couldn't even sense them, were numerous more youths just like him. Chapter 851. Lionel's eyes narrowed. He suddenly felt that his entire body was being chained down by something. He had a feeling that if he tried to cast a mage art, it would fall flat. He was even having a difficult time communicating with his lineage factors. In fact, of all his lineage factors, his spear domain lineage factor was the only one he could sense clearly. After some thought, Lionel realized that the only reason he could sense his lineage factors at all was likely due to King's might. If it wasn't for the will of King's might, it might have been possible that all of his strength would have been locked away. As for why he could sense his spear domain lineage factor the clearest, it was definitely because he currently held a spear in his hands. The combination of King's might, and this was likely why. These were only speculations in the end. Lionel had no way of being certain that his deductions were correct. What he did know, though, was that his body suddenly felt heavy without his snowy star owl lineage factor. He hadn't realized just how much he had relied on it. Due to the heaviness of his metal body, he was meant to be inherently slow and lumbering, especially at Tier 9. Of course, this problem was mostly mitigated because the metal synergy lineage factor was so high level, so the drawbacks weren't as obvious as other defensive lineage factors. However, that didn't mean there wasn't any trouble at all. Unfortunately, while these invisible chains could seal away much of his strength, it couldn't change the heaviness of his Tier 9 metal body. Now, not only did he have the drawbacks of a heavy body, he couldn't even activate his runes to maximize its usage. Fantastic! Lionel smiled bitterly as the illusory spirit before him finally formed. The spirit became a semi-transparent blue that looked like a paler shade of the star in the far-off distance. It didn't have a face, but it wore an elaborate armor. Whether by coincidence or intention, it too wielded a spear as it faced Lionel. Chapter 852. Aina dove into her father's arms, her tears falling like rain. For some odd reason, though, she was completely silent, her shoulders hardly trembling and her sobs having been completely stifled. Emil couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. 1, because Aina had jumped from a still-moving ship. 2, because his daughter was far taller than he thought she could be, and that was saying something considering his own height. And 3, because she was actually crying. Emil had never seen his daughter cry before. Aina had never personally witnessed her mother's death. Emil hadn't allowed her to. However, Aina had definitely experienced every bit of the curse being etched into her body as a little girl, and she hadn't shed a single tear then, something that definitely couldn't be said for Emil himself. Even when Emil was forced to separate from Aina, leaving her to Earth's orphanage system, he hadn't seen Aina shed a single tear. So what exactly was happening here? Was he seeing things? Was this maybe not his daughter at all? But with his demeanor and presence, who else would ignore it all just to hug him if not for his daughter? What Emil didn't know was that it wasn't that his daughter had never cried. It was just that she had never cried in his presence. This could be said to be the very first time it had happened, and he wasn't exactly sure how to react to it. If he knew this truth, he could probably guess why. After all, his method of training Aina in her youth had been no different from how he would have treated her had she been his son rather than his daughter. If he was honest, had Aina come sniveling and crying to him when she was 5 years old, it would have been more likely for her to receive a reprimanding as opposed to any sort of care and attention. If there was anything of the sort in Aina's life, it had only come from her mother who had long since passed. Chapter 853. Lionel released a steam-laden breath. He slipped his back foot further backward, anchoring himself with power, strength and leverage as he pierced forward. The moment he released the attack, he knew that his trajectory was off. This wasn't because he had aimed incorrectly, but rather because the spirits were becoming smarter and more skilled. It was maybe the world's greatest irony that on the day Lionel faced the most spearmen he had in his lifetime, that his spear domain heirloom, which was supposedly invincible against them, had become completely useless. Of course, he knew that this was likely because these were energy spears rather than real, tangible ones. But that didn't mean he didn't feel aggrieved. Lionel knew that it was too late to change his spear's path. Shifting his momentum had been easy in the past, but his current self was too slow and lacking in agility. His mind spun through several calculations before he made a choice. His Bodis momentum continued forward while falling slightly to the side. The anchor that had been his feet wavered, weakening his strike. But he also managed to just barely survive with just a graze to his shoulder. He used his fall to turn his pierce into a downward sweeping motion, raking his spear across the chest of the spirit. Chapter 854. Lionel took deep breaths, pushing himself up the rest of the way. If this most recent thought of his was correct, that would mean that the creator of Dimensional Cleanse, or at least whoever it was that set up this competition, did in fact want him to use his mind over the raw strength of his body. It was just that now, rather than applying it to puzzles, he or she wanted it applied in battle. Lionel would still remember the borderline narcissistic comments the creator of Dimensional Cleanse had left in the first part of their technique. Back then, Lionel had been in the Joan zone and his life was on the line every minute of every day, and yet he still couldn't help but chuckle. Even now, with his body in such a state, he was caught between rolling his eyes and laughing some more. When he framed things like this, if the creator was really the one who set up this fiasco, it was no wonder it was all so sadistic. That person was really a bastard. 97 seconds. Lionel thought to himself. He had to make it to the next spirit in that time, or else he would have to fight the one he just had again. The distance wasn't far, just a kilometer. But in this endless stretch of road, Lionel felt like banging his head against a wall. There's got to be something to this. The truth was that Lionel was at a striking disadvantage. It was very rare for those with powerful bodies to choose Dimensional Cleanse, of all things to practice. They would usually pick a technique that could supplement their power, not their mind. Chapter 855. Lionel's Dream Force acted. Thanks to his Dream Force having fused with his 3-star constitution, it wasn't restricted by the laws of this place. This thought led one of Lionel's split minds to explore the possibility of fusing other forces with his stars, but it was quickly dismissed. It had required a very special set of circumstances to allow for this. Lionel soon ran into another problem though. He had never constructed any star elemental mage arts. It took a second of his time left, more than he had even spent to deduce things to this level, to reformulate a simple arrow spell to be formed with a star elemental foundation. The moment the mage art was complete, to Lionel's pleasant surprise, an arrow of sparkling star force radiating a pure silverish white appeared. In fact, Lionel realized the abundance of star force was so great in this place that the spell was completed about 10% faster than it would have otherwise been. Lionel nodded to himself. This was a good sign. He was learning more about this place. Though he was inwardly kicking himself for not trying to deduce these things earlier, it was better now than never. To Lionel, 97 seconds with his thinking speed and split minds might as well have been days. Though that 97 seconds was now 96. He adjusted himself, realizing the next time he calculated the restructuring of a spell, he would have to assign more minds to it to cut down on the time. Though it was a shame he never formulated any star elemental spells. There was no use crying over spilt milk. Now was a unique opportunity. But he also wasn't foolish enough to believe that this alone was enough. The road ahead was nearly endless. Now that he could use spells, he would indeed have some added flexibility in battle. But it wasn't enough to be life-changing. At the very least, he would need time to formulate more powerful spells that would have a greater impact. Chapter 856. 3 young women and a large man shared a table in the private room of a restaurant. Among them, the blonde young girl clenched her hands tightly on her lap, staring down at the wooden patterns before her. Savon felt like she was walking on pins and needles. This had to be the oddest family dynamic she had ever been a part of. Emil hadn't even asked her about who she was or what she was doing here. After Yuri casually introduced her, that was the end of it, and he hadn't said a single word to her. In fact, he barely nodded, something she almost missed because she found it difficult to look him in the eye. The father was expressionless. The daughter was expressionless. The adoptive daughter was expressionless. This sort of family almost made her thankful that her own didn't have to step into the oddity of this world. Even if she had to be alone because of it, at least she and them would never reach a point where this was how they interacted. Finally, a waitress came into with large amounts of food. A bit of the pressure Savon felt was finally alleviated, because someone with a normal smile and expressions had come. Unfortunately, seemingly sensing the atmosphere, the waitress didn't dare to stay long and practically bolted away, holding up the hem of her skirt. Things only became worse after the food came. What once was an atmosphere of silence became filled with gnawing, cracking and chewing. If Savon closed her eyes, she would have thought that she was sitting amidst a pack of wolves. To Savon's right, Yuri elegantly cut apart her food with a fork and knife. However, across from her, the father and daughter pair seemed to be fighting to the death. Their elbows clashed every so often, causing resounding booms to reverberate through the air. It sounded almost like claps of thunder every time they struck. And yet, they continued to bite at the piles of meat and bone as though nothing had happened. Chapter 857. On one hand, there was Lionel's ability. As powerful as his lineage factors were, he still felt that it carried much of the burden for how he had made it this far. On the other, there was his spear domain lineage factor. It had been mostly neglected, but now it was practically his only path toward salvation. As powerful as his king's might lineage factor had the potential to be, not only did Lionel not have enough subordinates to scale it properly, it was ultimately just a supplement to strength he already had. This led him right back to his spear domain lineage factor. Lionel's brows furrowed as the time continued to tick by. It was an impossible question. It had taken him fractions of a second to think to this point. The moment he came up to this blockage, time seemed to flow like water, and its speed was only getting faster. Even after 80 seconds was left, Lionel still hadn't made any headway to answering this question. Did he just have to abandon his ability entirely? But that couldn't be right. Cutting off his ability would feel no different from losing an arm to him. Who was to say that there wouldn't be a point in battle where it would be useful? But Lionel couldn't just leave things as is. It obviously wasn't working how things were now. If he just tried to press forward, he really could be that brainless meathead the creator was trying their best to weed out completely. 60 seconds. It was like trying to hold two extremes at once. Was it even possible? Chapter 858. The memory suddenly hit Lionel like a ton of bricks. It was as though he had thought of something, but the true ramifications, or maybe more accurately, implications of it didn't hit him until a moment later. It felt like he was on a roller coaster with everything whizzing by so fast it was difficult for his eyes to keep track. But there was just that one small moment that appeared for just long enough to catch his attention, just barely. That day. That was the first and one of the only times Lionel had ever allowed one of the consciousnesses to take over his body. It had given him combat prowess far beyond his means at that time. Ultimately, though, what he had done that day was out of necessity rather than desire. After all, he had only just stepped out of his second zone, and hadn't even really understood what it meant to wield a spear. It also had to be remembered that he had had the spear domain heirloom for all of a few minutes at that point, so he wasn't even really sure what he was getting himself into. However, what was especially memorable and important about that time was the fact that the primitive consciousness hadn't snatched his body away forcefully. In fact, Lionel was able to take his mind back as he pleased. He never truly felt that he wasn't in control. Lionel wasn't sure if this was how things were supposed to have gone, or if he had been meant to struggle to keep his mind safe, but all of that was irrelevant. The fact that he was so clearly unaffected was a very good thing. The issue with allowing consciousnesses to take over his body was the blurring of the lines between what was you and what wasn't. But Lionel was able to define this line so clearly and easily that there wasn't even a chance at such confusion. The question was the answer to allow his body to be taken over? What was so powerful about that memory was that Lionel had been able to take a back seat and observe everything while his body was being controlled by another. If things were like this, then he could take a step back and calculate the progression of battle. This would allow him to step in should he ever be needed. Chapter 859. The blade of red energy looked no different from a real blade. It shook the surrounding air, sparkling with a translucent sheen that emitted a grandiose power. However, its majesty was overwhelmed by the ever-growing sound of blades clanging against one another. A strong force whipped about Lionel, forming into a growing dome of strength that enveloped him, and eventually even the spirit before him. What did it mean to have a spear domain lineage factor? All this time, Lionel had focused too much on the spear aspect. However, it was precisely due to this that he had ended up neglecting one of the most powerful cards in his hand. It was like a clash of memories was finally coming together into one, forming a full picture that Lionel had completely missed until now. That day his consciousness was taken over. That day he mastered the primitive consciousness for the first time. That day he touched upon the true form of universal force, causing him to step upon the king's path. That day he finally realized that he was truly meant to be a king. What was a domain? What was the spear domain lineage factor? An indifferent light reflected in Lionel's gaze. He took a step forward, his spear spinning in his hand, following an elegant arc. Chapter 860. The young man's sword slightly twisted in his hand, the flat of its blade catching the blue rays of sun coming from the distance and sparkling with a translucent sheen. He wasn't sure why it was he had looked in that direction. It was just the feeling of something familiar. As for what it was, he had no idea. Curious. His robes fluttered, his steps seemingly slow but his true pace being at tens of meters a second. He seemed to effortlessly glide forward. His sword vibrated in his hands continuously, almost eager to the point of flying out of his hand. Haha. He could no longer hold back his grin. It's been a long while since I, the sword deity, has met something that made my blade thirst. Sword deity was, of course, not his name. In fact, it wasn't even close. The truth was that even others hadn't given him this name like one might expect. He had named himself. If one went even deeper to the true root of the matter, no one even knew of him. After the humor of it all faded away, those who understood how the strongest powers of the dimensional verse worked would sink into their own solemn expressions, looking toward this young man with arrogance that could poke a hole in the skies with the utmost seriousness. Chapter 861. The Viola family estate was impossibly large. One might think that this meant a few hundred acres, or maybe they owned a small forest to themselves, but even this wasn't thinking nearly large enough. The estate of this family wasn't limited to such a small range. In fact, even a large city wasn't enough to cover it all. Instead, it was constructed by a network of 10 large cities that encompassed an area equivalent to a small state, about 30,000 square kilometers. Despite the impossibly large region for just a single estate, it was difficult to find even a single blade of grass that was out of place. And this was despite the fact that much of the region between the 10 cities were used as tempering grounds for the younger generation. One would think that it was nothing but an enormous and well-kept garden. This estate was, of course, just private property. Only the members of the Viola family and their vassals were allowed to step foot in the region. The only exception was when the family hosted some competitions in their tempering regions, but even then, it would mostly be used from comparatively powerful families participating. Rarely, the Viola family would hold such competitions to find new vassals like Aina's father. But this had many hoops to jump through to even be considered, the least of which were exorbitant fees, not to mention many rounds of screening. It could be said that not only were vassals extremely rare in comparison to the number of the Viola family members, each one was a talent that could even match up to the heirs of the family, not that they would ever have a chance at succession. As the only daughter of a Viola family vassal, Aina had certain privileges as well. Due to the rarity of vassals and given the size of the estate, it wasn't surprising that the father-daughter pair would have a large mansion and room all to their own. In fact, their living abode could be considered to be an estate as well, just that it was more normal in size. The accommodations left by the Viola family for their subordinates were quite excellent. Most vassals who managed to succeed would move their entire families over to subordinate themselves to the Viola family. So Emil had enough room to accommodate thousands of people, but there was usually no one but himself. Chapter 862. Elthar slowly picked himself up, shaking his head. He was getting really tired of having to get into all of these fights, not because he hated fighting, but because he always had to hold back. The ones he could kill, he couldn't kill. As for the ones he couldn't kill even if he tried, those were even more agonizing. Did they get off from beating a kid like him? Just because your wife was giving me googly eyes, doesn't mean I touched her. Shouldn't you blame yourself for her eyes wandering? Elther looked up and glared at the gorilla-sized bastard he had just knocked out. His fists were really too itchy at this point. At that moment, though, Elther's pupils suddenly constricted. His head snapped up to the skies, his eyes narrowing. This is most definitely not part of the plan. Elther mumbled to himself. The Oryx community, despite their advancements toward the importance of the mind in conjunction with the body, was still quite primitive. Their sanitation wasn't the best, their roads were still paved of dirt, their homes were simple constructs of wood, mud and dried grass. They were ultimately still living in a time countless centuries behind everyone else. One of the tasks Elther was left with by Lionel was to improve this. However, the method in which he did so was also important. Chapter 863. Lionel had no idea what was going on so far away from himself. It was true that he had never considered the possibility that someone would try to form diplomatic relations with the Oryx, but this was mostly because of how unlikely that it was. The Oryx were not human. This was maybe the most important reason. Though racism wasn't very prevalent amongst humans any longer, at least not in Lionel's experience, that was only because it was replaced by another sort of race war, one between species. Unfortunately, no matter where you were, racism was an almost inevitable part of life. There was nothing people liked to do more than participate in tribalism. The grotesque part of it all was that it was rooted in good. People had the inherent want to be connected and feel connected to one another. It was just unfortunate that this good was often twisted and contorted into what Lionel believed to be the ugliest thing in the world. What better way to feel more connected to those around you than to exclude the others? If everyone was connected, was anyone connected at all? It was these kind of thoughts that had always pervaded the psyche of the dimensional verse, and it manifested in the form of race wars all too often. It could be said that the only reason Earth had weeded out racism was because of its hands-on approach. The Ascension Empire fused the continents into one. A monolithic culture was formed. There were no large swaths of communities where only a single type of face could be seen. Of course, Earth still had its own in-groups and out-groups, that being the people who could call the surface home, and those that could not. But they had still made great leaps and bounds in that direction. And it was about the only thing Lionel respected about his grandfather's empire. However, outside of Earth, these things couldn't be said to be the same. Chapter 864. Lionel took another large breath. The spiraling of Blue Star force this time was even more violent and rampant. Every ounce of force within 10 meters surged toward him, filling his lungs to the point they seemed like they might burst. Not quite. Almost there. Lionel's mind spun, undergoing several calculations at a time as he continuously adjusted the force art. However, as Lionel progressed, he quickly realized he was approaching a bottleneck. His progress was slowing and he subconsciously felt that he would reach a barrier he couldn't push past with more calculations very soon. This wasn't the first time Lionel had run into such a problem. While he was force crafting, there were many times the blueprints he thought of couldn't quite meet he marked the wanted them to. When things reached that point, the best choice was to always scrap the design and start anew because this barrier definitely meant that there was a fundamental flaw to his approach. A fundamental flaw, HM? Lionel's gaze suddenly sharpened as he took a heavy step backward. A blade of blue swung down heavily before him, missing the tip of his nose by just a hair. A fine line of blood trickled down and dripped from Lionel's nostrils, his pupils constricting to an extreme. Chapter 865. Lionel felt his body surging toward a barrier with such momentum that even he himself couldn't stop it even if he chose to. Lionel believed that he had understood the purpose of this trial. Maybe it wasn't that this was a puzzle at all, and maybe there wasn't the reward of the remaining portions of dimensional cleanse waiting at the end for him. What if the entire purpose of this road was to comprehend the next step of dimensional cleanse, yourself? What did it mean for Lionel to say that battery was the wrong shape? Well, all this time, the perfect image was hanging before him. He continuously tried to use the blue star force as though it was normal air he could breathe in, before then trying to adjust it to function like oxygen would. But, was that the right way to do things? Then there was the blue star force that fused into his body and kept making him heavier. Why did it feel like the process was eerily similar to what one experienced when entering the fourth dimension? Wasn't that the dimensional realm one spent time tempering their bodies and drawing more nodal pathways? On top of that, there was the fact that Lionel felt he was using the blue star force all wrong. He felt that if he wanted to get the most out of it, taking star force from the surroundings and directly applying it to himself was the wrong method. If he wanted to flip the table and approach this from a completely different angle, then he believed that the best course of action to take would be to accept the star force into his body, convert it into the form he needed, and only then would he apply it to himself. But this process, how was it any different from his 3-star constitution? Chapter 866. The 3 swirling masses of blue star force began to compress as the silver-white star force continued to pulse. They fed off one another, seemingly trying to find some sort of balance. However, maybe in the history of the dimensional cleanse technique, no one had ever formed all 3 stars of the 4th dimension at once. There were 3 foundation layers for dimensional cleanse. The first was for the 3rd dimension, the second for the 4th, and the last for the 5th. Each would produce a maximum of 3 stars, of which most wouldn't be capable of forming even one. However, let alone not forming even one. Lionel had suddenly begun to form 3 at once, and no matter how he tried to slow the process, so that this splitting headache would leave him alone, nothing would work. The truth of the matter was that Lionel's body had been ready to spill over to the next dimension for too long now. Not to mention the fact he had one parent who was bestowed the complete world spirit of a world with 8th dimension potential on one hand. On the other, he had a parent born from a 7th dimensional world that had birthed a clan with a lineage factor with 8th dimensional potential as well. The fact he had remained in the 3rd dimension for so long, all while spreading his limits thin through his metal body and his dream force, was almost a form of blaspheming. If it wasn't for the fact his body didn't know how to progress to the next level, it would have long since done so. It was like a hole had been poked through the barrier toward Lionel's next advantage, large waves of crashing waters ramming through it, and forcing it wider and wider. If it was said that the best breakthrough was one that came naturally, this was more than just natural. It was almost like a wine locked away for thousands of years, fermenting to the point of achieving a potency that could knock someone out with a single whiff, let alone a sip. The trouble was that Lionel's body had to be the bottle that contained it all, and it was on the verge of collapsing. Lionel roared into the skies, his body pulsing with a blinding light. Chapter 867. Lionel's body, which had been lifted from the star road, fell back down heavily upon it. He landed on his feet, but his face was obstructed by the sheer length of his light violet hair. It covered his body and his face, cascading for hundreds of meters as though it had a mind of its own. Lionel exhaled a breath. Even from beneath his endless pile of hair, the billowing steam made its presence known. Lionel's long hair blew out of the way, revealing a body that put even Hephaestus to shame. Despite the fact Lionel had never been as obsessed with training his body as Hephaestus was, it seemed that his breakthrough had reformed his image into something the Romans would have carved out from white stone. From top to bottom, Lionel was covered in a sheen of colorless sweat that still pumped out what remained of his Bodis impurities. However, by this point, his body had grown so pure that even his sweat itself released a refreshing aura, smelling like a faint cinnamon with just the slightest touch of honey. The fibers of his muscles could be seen from beneath his skin, their steel cord-like construction wiggling about and following the contours of his tan. His abs seemed to have one too many pairs for a normal human, and large veins pumped throughout his body, giving him a vascularity that put most bodybuilders to shame. And yet he was a lean, explosive machine, even down to his defined quads and calves of his legs. Lionel knew that this must be the result of his metal body. He had never had such defined muscles in his life despite the fact he had always been fit. That was definitely the only explanation. And he was correct. When Lionel's body was reconstructed, the explosive strength of his metal body could finally manifest itself. The bulging strength that had been hiding all this time made itself known, threatening to burst out from Lionel's skin. Chapter 868. Lionel's fist shot forward, blasting the head of the spirit into pieces. After he was done, he almost felt bad about it. He had just reacted as quickly as he could, and didn't even think much. The poor guy didn't even get a chance to take a good look at his face. I should put on some clothes. Lionel, unfortunately, didn't have another pair of sweatpants, so he could only use Valiant Heart Mountain's white pair of hammer pants. It would have to do for now. Despite his success, Lionel didn't feel any sort of complacency. The road ahead still seemed endless, and it was impossible to tell how many more opponents he would need to face. Who knew, maybe after 100 more rounds, he would be right back to gasping for air. Thinking to this point, Lionel measured the change of his strength he calculated with his last leap, then adjusted himself immediately. It only made sense that he had missed the mark like this. Though Lionel had been taking measured steps in the past, that didn't mean he was going slow. At least not in the eyes of a normal human. After all, he had to cover a kilometer in less than 100 seconds. That would be like running that 100 meters 10 times at world-class third-dimensional speed. He had been trying to tap into that speed once again, but forgot to account for the change in his Boda's strength because he knew he was running out of time before the spirit appeared again. He didn't want to take on any added weight, he didn't have to. Chapter 869. A junior general couldn't be looked down upon. In fact, beside being a potential heir, it was the highest ranking a youth of the Viola bloodline could have. When a world reached a certain level, especially for the Viola families that had reached the pinnacle of its potential, the only way to grow and expand was by conquering the lands of other worlds. Of course, the best way to do this wasn't by fighting it out with worlds at your level. Rather, the best way was by targeting worlds beneath you. Lower-level worlds had certain protections that came either from tacit agreements, protection by higher-level worlds, and/or natural barriers. Earth, for example, is among a few lower-level worlds that had all three of these layers of protection. Due to its talent, it had gained the favor of numerous high-level worlds, all of which had invested in some way or another toward their continued progress. In addition, due to its exceptionally low dimensional level, the natural barriers of protection it had were leaps and bounds beyond most. One had to understand that crossing between folds of reality was always dangerous. However, crossing from a higher dimensional fold of reality to a lower fold as a higher dimensional being was both exceptionally difficult and exceptionally dangerous. The only exception to this is if one had a certain affinity for the fold of reality in question, for example, having been born there. This was all to say that the junior generals of the Viola family played a large role in bolstering their strength. It was they who led campaigns to lower-level worlds and conquered them in the name of their family. To gain such a right definitely meant that you were among the best the Viola family had to offer. However, being from the sixth city was a small knock on Samson's prestige among them. Do you want to read more chapters? The estate of the Viola family was formed of 10 cities. These were named by number and went from 9th to 1st. The 10th city was known as the main city. Chapter 870. Samson removed his foot from the armored youth's head and kicked him away toward a relay station not far from them. Get this bastard out of my sight. I have no interest in protecting dead weight. There weren't a small number of youths of the Viola bloodline that were unsatisfied with the vassal system. But there was nothing they could do. They didn't have the power to change things, and even when most of them did gain power, they chose to leave things as they were. The trouble was that vassals didn't have a very strong connection to the family to begin with. They were essentially glorified hired guns. So the best method the Viola family had to keep these experts by their side was to treat their families well. If a vassal died in the line of duty, their family would also be well taken care of. However, should that vassal not have an heir, their family would not be allowed to stay in the Viola estate. The trouble was that the descendants of vassals had an overinflated sense of worth. And this was especially so for descendants from vassals in the second, first and main cities. This was because the vassals in these cities were amongst the most important to rope in for succession wars. In such a situation, wouldn't it be too foolish to offend a family member of such a vassal? So why was it that Samson dared to do this at all? It was because Richard was a special case. He had the support of one of the two eternal vassals, one of the only two vassal families that managed to pass down their title from generation to generation. In addition to this, his mother's background wasn't simple, and should he succeed on the current expedition he was on, there was a 60% chance the claim to succession would be his. On top of that, the youth he had just kicked away had a father who was a vassal from the second city, and considering his lack of talent, there was no way this title would be passed down. Also, as far as Samson was concerned, the potential heirs that didn't dare to offend the youths of vassals never stood a chance at the head position to begin with. All right. Samson clapped, feeling that he had established his authority well enough. This zone is quite a special one. According to our analysis tools, it actually seems to be related to General Phi. After doing some research, I found out why. This region was among those the general conquered back in his youth. It was only after the empire fell that it then fell into our hands. Samson was about to continue explain, but he saw the blank looks on all their faces. Even the few he thought were comparatively better than the others, like those three masked women over there, didn't seem to know what he was talking about. Do you want to read more chapters? He shook his head, lamenting the state of these youths as though he wasn't actually younger than a lot of them. From a young age, he had been training to be a general. In addition, as a member of the Viola family's main bloodline, he had also been drilled with all sorts of history. However, the legend of General Phi shouldn't be one that one had to be a history buff to know. How could one be in the sixth dimension and have never heard of the Silver Empire? The name sounded simple, but it was just an unfortunate part of the language being lost in translation. To General Phi and his people, silver represented the highest prestige, an unmatched glory, but most importantly, an underestimated, unrefined talent that rose to the top. This last definition is why silver was the most appropriate translation, as it always lost out to more precious materials like gold, diamond or platinum. But it still wasn't exactly perfect. Our tri-pillar galaxy. Forget it, I'm not wasting my breath. All you need to know that it is very possible that we will have to face General Phi in his youth. I don't have the time or patience to protect all of you, so some might die. If you don't want to see your coffin lids close early, follow my instructions and cut the bullshit. With that, Samson turned and vanished into a swirling portal, almost a dozen youths following after him. It was an odd feeling indeed. Zones seemed to pass down legends of an age-long past. But what would happen if that age hadn't exactly ended yet? The discussion between Era and the Oryx didn't seem to last very long, just 3 hours. And yet, it felt like the tribe had suddenly become a swaying rowboat amidst an ocean of waves in just that small moment. The promises she made were quite monumental. She promised to hand this world over to them. She promised that they would have a place in this galaxy. And she promised that her success would be theirs. The Oryx weren't so naive to simply believe everything that was thrown at them. After all, they were an intelligent race of people. And they had more than enough experience dealing with humans, and even the much more powerful Valiant Heart Mountain. Or rather, the Valiant Heart Mountain of the past. However, the temptation was also great. In their current state of hyper-evolution, the Oryx had a very small window to either rocket to greater heights or crash, never to rise up again. Hyper-evolution wasn't something you could just sit idly by for and reap the benefits of. It was the last chance this world was giving them to claim what was theirs. If they couldn't fight for it, they would be finished. But if they got lost in the weeds battling the dying Valiant Heart Mountain, leaving themselves without enough room to expand beyond this world, then they would have wasted a golden opportunity. Of all the things, thoughts and plans Elthar had come with, what he was lacking the most in were the resources the Oryx tribe needed to crash through the barriers that were holding them back. Resources Era had in spades. You're tuning in to the Li Mei Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.